Okay. We are live. I am just going to wait a few more seconds for Rockfin to give me the green light as well, and we will begin. Go live on Rockfin, and we are ready to roll. We have with us the Oracle of London, Mr. Alexander Mercouris, and it is our special honor, great privilege to have with us once again Mr. Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you so very, very much for joining us on this live stream. Before we get started and I hand it over to Alexander and to yourself, I have your Twitter. I have your Twitter handle in the description box underneath, and I will have it pinned below in the comment section. I know you have a book out as well, Scott. Would you like to give everybody a plug?
You're asking about my book? You mean this one? Somebody gave me this mug, so I have to make use of it.
I think I see it right in back of you.
Right in the back too, yeah.
Right there.
No, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. It's a book about the INF Treaty, the conceptualization, the implementation of it, my role. Even though I was a very junior officer at the time, I ended up playing a fairly central role in the implementation of this treaty. And I think it's a history of arms control that everybody should. People need to understand that arms control is dead right now. Dead, literally, boom, stake through the heart. It's done. I just had a lunch last month with Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador. And if you know him, you know that he negotiated the New START Treaty. This is an arms control specialist. And he laments the fact that there's just nothing going on. Though we have one treaty left, New START. It expires in 2026. Nobody's working on bringing it up. There's no 5-year, extension. A new treaty will have to be negotiated. I know this business. We're talking 3 to 5 years. We are at the 3-year mark, the minimum necessary to have a basic kind of fundamental negotiations. And that only happens when you have two sides that are fully staffed with negotiating professionals, arms control specialists. They're all gone. It's like muscles. If you don't use them, they atrophy and go away. The only people that are talking arms control are the American Pentagon and the Russian Ministry of Defense. And they aren't talking arms control. They're talking about how they can use arms control to achieve advantages for themselves. That's the opposite direction we want to go in arms control. And everybody's sitting there going, wow, things are really bad. They are. But you know what? There is a template of success called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It was hard back then. Some people would say was harder back then than it is today because we were talking about doing things that had never been done before, like on-site inspection. And yet we did it, and it worked. It was wonderful. It happened to take place in a time of great turmoil, and that's part of the book. It's disarmament in the time of perestroika. So I talk about being an eyewitness to the implementation of perestroika and how that interacted with arms control and the problems that caused, et cetera. And I also just tell the story of the inspectors. I mean, we can talk about treaties, we can talk about processes and things of that nature. At the end of the day, it's humans on the ground doing amazing, remarkable things. And I talk about a certain group of humans who were the junior officers who were never intended to be part of this process. This was supposed to be an adult-run process where you have majors, lieutenant colonels, all of whom have advanced degrees, who have experience, who are knowledgeable. The last thing you want are lieutenants, because lieutenants don't know anything. But the good news is, by bringing in lieutenants, we weren't afraid of failure. Everybody else was intimidated by this. We just charged in there and got it done. And there's 4 in particular. Read the book. I'm one of them. And we helped save this treaty. And it's a story I'm very, very proud of. And it's not, but like I said, it's not just the history. Read this book in these dark times, and it will give you hope that arms control can happen and should happen and must happen.
Fantastic. I will have a link for that book as well down below as a pinned comment. So let's get going. Let's just say a quick hello to everyone that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on Rumble, and on YouTube. Hit that like, everybody, on all of those platforms. And a big shout out to everyone that is watching us on the Duran.locals.com. Thank you to our moderators, as always, Valies, Zarael, Peter, and I think that is everybody for now. Thank you very, very much to all of our moderators. Let's get this conversation started. Preventing a long war. Alexander, Scott, the floor is yours.
Indeed, and can we say nobody better to discuss this topic with than Scott? And Scott's been commenting, discussing, explaining the facts about the war since before the war started. I can remember you were there as the situation was deteriorating. You were explaining why it was deteriorating, why we seem to be heading towards the conclusion that we did. And I have to say this as well. I think of all the people who've covered the war, nobody's got it 100% right, and whoever does, war. We're talking about war. War is one of these things. It's the most unpredictable. I remember years ago reading, I think it was Machiavelli who said, don't start a war recklessly because it's the most unpredictable of all human endeavors. But if anybody who's got it most right, at its various stages, it's been you, Scott. You've described how things have evolved, the various interactions of the two armies, the interactions of the great powers. It's all been there. And of course, you've done it in so many... You've done it in so many different places, that it's absolutely essential to follow what you say and to keep on top of all the various things that you have been saying. So it's a huge privilege to have you. And Scott, you were talking about arms control. And actually, if you don't mind, towards the end of this program, perhaps not at the very end of the program, but, during the program, let's talk about that too, because, I'm old enough to remember the process of arms control as we led up to arms control situations. I even remember the negotiations around, SALT I and the ABM Treaty. I'm just old enough to remember all of that, the tip of my memory, and then SALT II and the INF Treaty and all of these things, how contentious and difficult they were, but how they didn't just control arms control, they built peace. That was the most extraordinary thing about them. And they didn't just build peace, but they changed the world. They changed Russia.
Can I just add one thing real quick there on that topic? On December 8th, it was the 35th anniversary of the signing of the INF Treaty. And there was a reunion in Washington, D.C. of all the old INF hands, the negotiators. Yeah. Some of them are in their 80s and 90s. So they're getting up there. And then, of course, there's the young guys back then who are now a little in the year. But we were all there talking. And they invited a senior U.S. government official responsible for arms control who spoke off the record, so can't be named, et cetera. But this person was so arrogant about the role they play today and almost sort of casually dismissive of what we did back then. Oh, you did some important things back then. No, ma'am. We saved the world. And we pointed this out over and over again. Without the INF Treaty, and I will make this statement over and over, none of us would be here. The world would be over. We were headed towards the nuclear apocalypse. Pershing II missiles in West Germany were one of the worst ideas in the history of deployment of weapons. 5 to 7 minutes away from taking out Moscow, put Moscow on the razor's edge with their SS-20 missile force, hundreds of missiles with 3 nuclear warheads each aimed at a European city. It was game, set, match. There were so many close calls. You can only play Russian roulette so long before the bullet goes off and blows your brains out. So anybody who just is dismissive of arms control is this quaint little thing. Hey, wake up. You wouldn't be here. And I'll tell you what, I normally don't like to do this. Thank me and thank the others who did it. All right? Because if it weren't for us, you wouldn't be alive today. So I don't want to hear a damn thing about anybody trivializing the past. Not you. I'm not blaming you. I'm just getting fed up with people who are like, yeah, but that was history. No, dude, that saved your life. That literally saved your life. And you better appreciate that reality, because if you don't, then you're not going to push for the absolute necessity of arms control today, because we are headed down the same path. The United States is going to deploy Dark Eagle hypersonic missiles. They actually resurrected the same artillery brigade, I think the 56th, in Germany, that had the Pershing IIs, and they're proud of it. Hey, you know those bullets we put in the game to play Russian roulette back then? We're taking the same gun, putting new bullets in, and we're playing the same game. How stupid can that be? Anyways, I apologize.
No, you don't. You shouldn't apologize at all, Scott, because I remember the atmosphere at the time very well. I remember how dangerous it was. I remember how afraid we all were. I'm worried that we don't have the same fears today. People are far too complacent about the situation. In fact, I'm incredulous at how complacent people have become. And frankly, the people who were opposed to arms control then were never as dangerous as some of the people we see today, who are very, very dangerous indeed.
Well, some of them are the same people, like the mustachioed one.
Yeah,
John
absolutely.
Bolton, same
Absolutely.
dude, been around forever.
Absolutely, he's been around. Absolutely, but that, of course, has to bring us back to the war, because, of course, the war, to some extent, in fact, not to some extent, to a very, very great extent, is connected with all of this. And of course, if you want to see the extent to which that's so, you only need to go back to Putin's statements when the war began. He was really worried, and I am absolutely sure he was genuinely worried about American missiles in Ukraine, bringing them close to Moscow, unbelievably dangerous ideas. And Biden comes along at one point in a discussion with Putin, seems to say, well, yes, we've got no such plan to do that. Let's talk about it. And then a few days later, he turns around and says, well, actually, the American government says, well, actually, that's not what we were thinking. We weren't prepared to talk about these things. And that was one of the major factors, in my opinion, that led to the war. And of course, Boris Johnson, our disastrous former prime minister, who's still around, is misrepresenting all of this. I mean, he's distorting the record. It's quite clear to me that Putin was talking about missiles in Ukraine pointing at Moscow, and Johnson, disgracefully, is turning it around and implying that it was missiles in Moscow pointed at him, which is not just stupid and even comical, it's also dangerous and crazily aggrandizing. But we've got to get to the war. As I said, Scott, you've covered it better, I think, than anybody else. And of course, you've got also the experience of planning war. Where are we now? I mean, I've been seeing all sorts of people talking about this, the fact that we're at a turning point. We seem to have these huge Russian armies now, or at least they're big Russian armies, being gathered around Ukraine. We see the Russians now definitely, on the front foot in Donbass, Bakhmut, Solidar, Vuhledar, all of these places, those of us who get into the weeds, as I do every day, by the way, we're seeing that all evolve. But, we mustn't lose the big picture. And I can remember, and this is, I want to say this, back in the spring, early summer, you were saying this Russian operation is going too slow. The Russians are underestimating all of these Western American weapons that are going to go into Ukraine. You are absolutely right about that. I think the Russians did. I think not for the first time. The Russians were probably overestimating the rationality of the people, some of the people that they were dealing with. I think they were still thinking at that time that there had to be, that, there was going to be some kind of an agreement at some point. Well, they were wrong about that. But over the last few weeks, over the last few months, in fact, they've clearly taken steps very much in line with what you were saying they should do. They've done it. And now things are changing. And I get the sense that in Western capitals, at least those capitals that are committed to this, there's now a mixture of panic and doubt. But Scott, I've been talking a lot. You've got much to say. Tell us what you think.
It's your show, man. You get to say it.
But you're our guest, and
Well,
we
thank
brought
you.
you here.
I just, before I go, Sparky put up a comment there that just has to go, can't go unanswered. Uh, in 1978, we crushed the Stuttgart Stallions. I, of course, played football on the Kaiserslautern Red Raiders, and the key to that victory was, of course, a diving one-handed 45-yard reception in the middle that gave us a first down on 3rd and 7 that allowed us to go forward and score the winning touchdown that broke the spirit of the Stuttgart Stallions. So stick it in your ear. Okay, that humorous aside, everybody's like, what the hell is he talking about? Look, the bottom line is this: Russia made a lot of mistakes. Everybody does. I think we need to understand that when this war started, Russia had limited combat experience. The conflict in Syria, some of the Air Force was getting some experience, but they were getting experience like American Air Force gets experience, flying in in very permissive environments. I mean, it's very easy to drop precision guided weapons on a target when no one's trying to shoot you down. Okay, so everybody's sitting there going, they got great combat experience. I'm saying they got no combat experience. It's literally flying over a bombing range. That's it. You get to do some electronic warfare against the Americans. You get to do some shadow flying against the Americans, but you had people on deconfliction lines making sure it never got out of control. On the ground, some activity, some interaction with Turkish drones, some interaction with Turkish soldiers, but it wasn't large-scale ground combat like we're seeing right now. The same thing in Chechnya. The 2005 is when that conflict ended, and that was really some large-scale, low-intensity conflict. I'm not saying that it wasn't intense. I'm not saying it wasn't brutal. I'm saying it wasn't what's going on right now. So Russia entered this with a lot of theory, just like everybody else. Ukraine had theory. Russia had theory, NATO had theory. Then theory meets reality. And sometimes military theory, when it's tempered with political desire, and I think that's what we're seeing a lot with what happened in the initial phase of the SMO, Special Military Operation, was the political desire for a relatively bloodless victory. The hope that based upon some intelligence preparation of the battlefield that may or may not have taken place, that somehow the Ukrainians would have been more receptive to a rapid advance by Russian troops that disregarded all common sense when it came to flank and rear area security. Just go, 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 go in an effort to get the Ukrainians to say, we give up, we're not going to do this. They were wrong. I mean, and in retrospect, it's easy to say, wow, how could you have possibly have thought that? I mean, now that we know, but remember, we didn't know this then. Now that we know that Poroshenko, Merkel, and Hollande have all admitted that Minsk was an absolute farce and that the sole purpose of it was to train the Ukrainian military to be prepared to engage in combat operations with the Russians to liberate Donbass and perhaps Crimea. Now, if that had been a going-in assumption, then I would have said you might want to take this Ukrainian military a little bit more seriously than you are. But they didn't. And as a result, they got a bloody nose. Not a knockout, though. I mean, this is what I don't understand. The world is saying, well, the Ukrainians knocked the Russians back. The Russians kicked the snot out of the Ukrainians in the early phases. Yes, they suffered casualties. There's no doubt about that. My God, anybody will suffer casualties. If you put a convoy on the road with no security and people ambush you, you will die. That will happen to America, the Brits, the French, anybody. No military in the world can sit there and say, I would have come out of that one okay. No, I'm sorry. A well-executed ambush results in dead people all the time. And the Russians were subjected to several well-executed ambushes. But Russia advanced rapidly. They threatened Kiev. Now, people say, well, they didn't take it. I don't know if they intended to. It's hard to talk about taking a city of 5 million with 60 to 80,000 troops. It's very difficult to come up with a scenario where that is plausible. It is possible to talk about a feint operation designed to put pressure on the Ukrainians to get them to do what? And we now know what the what was. Russia was angling for a peace negotiation. They were the only serious ones. They were actually negotiating in good faith. When people say that Russia retreated from Kiev, retreated from Sumy, no, they withdrew. And we now know that it was indeed a gesture of goodwill telling the Ukrainians, we are serious about not occupying your country. We would like to sit down at the table with you and bring this thing to an end. And the end state would have simply been Crimea and the Donbass. That's it. Nothing else. Russia would have withdrawn from everything else. And it would have been with a huge political cost to Putin to do this. The hue and cry and outrage in Russia would have been immense if he left Zaporizhia, he left Kherson, and left it only with the Donbass. But he was going to do that. He was ready to close the deal. And it was the Ukrainians. Everybody's saying, Boris Johnson came in and put pressure on them. No, the head of the SBU saying we were never serious about it. It was always what? To buy time. To buy time for what? Well, we now know that the CIA and Scott Ritter's not the only one who thought that the Russians were going to roll through and win this thing in a week. All right, now I will tell you this right now without fear of contradiction. Had Russia come in doctrinally, they would have rolled through and won in a week. Had Russia come in with 200,000 screaming memes, rolling through, shooting everything up, blowing things up doctrinally, leveling everything with doctrine, the Ukrainians would not have been able to handle that. And it would have been over in a week. But that's not how they came in. And as a result, the Ukrainians adapted. And it's that adaptation that led to, I believe, a major miscalculation on the part of NATO and the United States, who bought into their own propaganda and said, Russia can't win. Russia is weaker than we thought. Oh my God, friends, you couldn't be more wrong. Russia just had insufficient resources to the task. The United States, when we went into Iraq in 2003, went in with just short of 200,000 troops. Wasn't enough. Thank God the Iraqis folded, because we came up to the Karbala area and we had to pause because we outran our logistics. We were at risk. Had the Iraqis launched a major counterattack at that point in time, it could have been trouble for us. Any army that engages in a major military undertaking with insufficient resources is going to lose. Every single time. It doesn't matter how well trained you are, how well equipped you are, how good your leadership is. Human beings can only do so much. And when you're asking the Russians to defend a frontage of over 1,000 kilometers with less than 30 to 50 men per kilometer, use your brain. It doesn't work. And that's, and that's what happened to the Russians. They were overextended, insufficient resources. For political reasons, they opted not to mobilize. They thought they could get this thing done on the cheap. Didn't work. Failure. But it doesn't mean they lost. But NATO decided to double down, and we have the thank God, was that a dog? Please tell me it was a dog.
It was.
Oh yes, thank you, Maverick. You have permission to bark now. Okay. I got in a lot of trouble the other day because my dog interrupted a big interview with Judge Napolitano, and people still haven't forgiven me for that.
Well, we forgive you.
On the Duran, dogs, cats.
They heard you. They're going. It's great. Okay. That's your dog's fault. Triggered it. Anyways, I'm sorry. I'm disruptive here. The point is that, we're going over old ground here. NATO doubled down, brought in tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment. And this was, as I said at the time, a game changer. You literally changed the game. And Russia adapted. And Russia thought now that they can fall back and just simply push on a liberation of the Donbass. But you couldn't, because again, you have a huge frontage, insufficient resources. With NATO assistance, Ukraine was able to carry out very effective counterattacks, liberating Kharkov and Kherson. Ancient history. In September, Russia did something that fundamentally altered everything. They grew up. They literally grew up. And they sat down, they said, okay, we're going to make some hard decisions. We're going to give up territory that's going to be politically difficult for us to explain, but we're going to preserve lives, preserve resources, and then we're going to mobilize. Not a full mobilization. They don't need it. They're going to mobilize with the resources sufficient to the task. 300,000 men. Plus, remember, no one's talking about the about 180,000 volunteers that have been mobilized also. And they did that. Now, the beauty of what the Russians have done is they're just operating on their timetable. I mean, I'm amazed how many people are like, 300,000, well, where are they? They're getting trained. There's a thing called training. It's very important, by the way, not to rush it. They're being equipped with sort of the best equipment in the world, and they're learning how to use it in operational theory that has been adapted to a new reality. They're not simply pulling out the old playbook and saying, let's learn how to do a, old-fashioned single wing football formation. They're going, no, we need to go back in the pocket and throw, baby, because that's the new football. And they're training their guys to do this. And they're doing it very patiently. And remember, the war didn't stop during this time. Since May, Russia has been fighting a major offensive against the Bakhmut-Soledar front, one of the most heavily defended places on earth. And it's been a grinding, brutal war. Some people have, Colonel McGregor, who I have tremendous respect for, has talked about 14 brigades. I think the equivalent probably closer to 20 brigades. A brigade is 4,000 to 5,000 men. They're suffering 80, 90% casualties before they're pulled out. Do the math. I mean, I can get a calculator and do it, but that's a lot of Ukrainians getting burned up right there, which has been the strategy of the Russians. They've consolidated their lines. They brought in an initial group of 80,000. They took the most recent, people who most recently left service, who have the most recent experience. They brought them in. They gave them refresher training. They brought them in as manpower replacement. They filled up the lines. They've consolidated their defenses. They're defending doctrinally. Every time the Ukrainians now try to launch an attack, they get their nose smashed because they're going up against hardened points. They split. They go into predetermined cauldrons of fire, and then the Russians rain down death and destruction. That's the end of the Ukrainians. If by chance they penetrate, which they haven't yet, they penetrate the front line of defense, and whoop, lo and behold, there's the secondary line of defense. Again, fully manned this time. It's not for show. They're there with the sufficient artillery to blow the living dog poop out of the Ukrainians. And if they, God, happen to get through that as well, there's the third line of defense because the Russians are defending doctrinally. And while the Ukrainians are blasting through first line, second line, third line, in theory, because they've never gotten through the first line, then the reserves, organized reserves, dedicated reserves come in with a vicious counterattack and annihilate them from the face of the earth. This is the reality. This is why anybody who thinks that Ukraine is going to organize some sort of miraculous offensive that's going to take Melitopol, as Zaluzhny hypothesized in his interview with The Economist, is just smoking dope. Literally can't happen. You can't do it with 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, 70,000. You can't do it. First of all, remember this: the more troops the Ukrainians concentrate, the more targets the Russians have. And so the mailed fist just isn't going to happen. Every time they've brought together multiple battalions, they get slaughtered before they get to the front. This is what Russia's doing. Meanwhile, in the background, there's 200,000 to 300,000 dudes that are doing push-ups on a daily basis, eating raw meat, and getting trained. And they have generals who are actually pretty damn good. I mean, people can, excuse my language, I apologize. I don't mean to swear. I'm getting a little spun up, so I'll calm down. I'll have a sip of Diet Coke. But their generals are pretty good. They've been denigrated. These guys are good. And the thing is, I've always said, generals are good. Staffs are better. And the Russians have some of the best staff work going. The general staff from the top, the general staff on down to each one of the battle staffs are comprised of very sharp junior officers who know what the hell they're doing. They plan meticulously, and they plan in a very efficient manner for deadly operations. And these guys are coming up with a plan of action that will maximize Russian combat potential. And we see it playing out right now. Has the Russian offensive started? Everybody's asking that question. Yes and no. Yes, the Russians are shaping the battlefield. You mentioned these attacks that are taking place throughout the front. None of them are the main event. The Russians haven't committed the bulk of their forces. But these are attacks that are designed to take advantage of the bad situation Ukraine has found itself in. Back in September, I was saying the Ukrainians are blowing their reserves, man. They built up this 70,000 man, mailed fist. And I'm like, why don't you use that as a fire brigade? A fire brigade, you see, and let the Russians attack, and then you punch them back, pull back, attack, boom. And you might have a chance of bleeding the Russians down. That would be a wise strategy if I were the Ukrainians. None of this nonsense about retaking land. What you want to do is destroy the Russian will to continue the fight. And you do that by maximizing Russian casualties. They failed. They threw it in there. They went for the quick territorial gains, the quick propaganda, selfie pictures in Izium and Kharkov. And now they've lost everything. They've got nothing left, literally. And so what the Russians are doing now, it's like a cat playing with the chipmunk. I have 2 cats, unfortunately, in the summertime. They do horrible things to chipmunks. And a lot of times it's just simply letting the chipmunk think it's away, then bringing it back, and eventually, and that's it. That's what the Russians are doing right now. They got Bakhmut going on. Bakhmut is just the meat grinder. It's slaughtering the Ukrainians, and it's become one of these politicized battles. It has military importance, but it's politicized. Both sides have committed to this fight. It's sort of like Stalingrad, where the Germans just stupidly said, instead of pulling back and bypassing, we're going to put everything in Stalingrad, and suddenly became a bigger battle than it needed to be. Bakhmut is a bigger battle than it needs to be because Ukrainians can't say we're losing, but they are, and they're going to be decisively defeated there. But by pouring in so much of their resources, their limited resources, they've got nothing. So the Russians then move towards Zaporizhia. And now the Ukrainians are going, holy cow, they've advanced 7 kilometers. Reserves that we don't have go to Zaporizhia trying to send it. So the Russians engage there decisively. This is bloody fighting, by the way. The Russians are taking losses. Anybody that doesn't believe that doesn't know anything about modern war. But the Russians are killing far more of them than they are of themselves, and they're holding on to them. They've just reached out and they grab them. That's the important thing here. Grab them and don't let them go. Force them to stay there. And then Uladar. Go up against Uldar. Bloody fighting, tough fighting. But you reach out and you grab the Ukrainians and you pull them in and you just grind it out, gnashing of the teeth, gouging of the eyes. Ukrainians put more resources there. Then the Russians go even further north. Boom, same thing. And what have Russians done? They haven't committed any of their main force, and they have the Ukrainians right now in confusion. They literally have nobody left. When Ukraine started this thing back in say June, there's talk about 700,000 troops. They had gone through a major mobilization, 700,000 troops. I don't think anybody can say that Ukraine has more than 220,000 troops left. They don't have anything left, which means, Stratfor came out with a number that I think is pretty low. 305,000 dead. No, I think it's 350,000, man. I was saying 250,000 dead back in July. Because again, my brain knows how to take armies, bring them together, go crunch, 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 fire, 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 probability to kill, massive fire, boom. They're losing everything. And everybody's like, no, they're not. I'm like, oh, yes, they are. And the proof now is because they have nothing left. And you see them desperately sweeping people up from the streets to get the buys there. Why? Because they have 40 to 50,000 guys. Their best troops, by the way. They're out getting trained right now. They're in England getting trained on the Challenger. They have pilots out there getting trained on the F-16. They have other guys getting trained on the Bradley, on the Martyr, on all this disparate equipment that may or may not arrive on the battlefield at some point in time. But that's it. Then when they come in, there's nothing left. There's not a second wave of personnel out there. Ukraine's burned through everything. They're talking about bringing in refugees now, trying to get nations to say, return the manpower. Meanwhile, Russia, I don't know. You got to be careful about propaganda, but I know people that aren't propagandists who live in places like Moscow. And I watched them celebrate Christmas. And that wasn't a city at war. I know that Russia's put some air defense systems up right now, and that's the wise thing to do. When you have the Ukrainians talking about modifying systems to become long-range suicide drones, you have to take these proper steps. But Moscow's not a city in panic. Russia's not a nation in panic. They're people who are resigned to the fact that they are at war, and that's the important thing here. Russians know they're at war, and they want a victory. They demand a victory. They will accept nothing less than a victory. Ukraine, on the other hand, is a defeated party, literally a defeated. Listen to Zelensky. But first of all, let's go back to Zaluzhny. If I don't get 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 artillery pieces, I will lose. Straight up said it. I will lose. Well, he didn't get that. Now, Zelensky has taken the corollary of that, which is, if I don't get my Abrams tanks by August, it's all over. What do you mean it's all over, Mr. President? You mean you lost? Now, and here's the pathetic thing. If he actually thinks that 30 Abrams tanks is going to turn the tide, is more of a political cry for help, telling the Americans, I need you to commit politically because I'm losing face here back at home. My army no longer trusts me. My people don't trust me. Nobody trusts me. I need you to salvage my reputation by giving me the tanks. Don't just tell me you're going to give me the tanks and then say, well, you're not getting them until next year. Zaluzhny has told him the hard truth. Mr. President, we've lost this war in August. And that's what I said earlier, that this war is going to be won by the end of summer, early fall of this year. And it's going to be. Russians are going to win.
I think that's a masterly summary, if I can say, Scott. And a couple of things. Alex and I, we as I say, we go into the weeds every day. Hard job. We don't actually find it an easy thing to do. And of course, we're neither of us with a military background, but even we have been able to work out one thing, which you said, which is that all of these attacks that we're seeing along the front line in Bakhmut, in Vuhledar, in Zaporozhye, this is not this big new forces that the Russians are building up. These are actually the obviously reinforced, replenished, resupplied units that were there before. They were all there. The Wagner organization was there before. In June, the Naval Infantry Brigade that's attacking in Vuhledar, they were there before. They've been there since March, in fact.
You mean the one that was decimated? I love it. The Ukrainians were spreading that news. They were all killed. Well, not all of them. They seem to be launching a pretty good offensive right now.
Yeah, and not if you believe the British Ministry of Defence, by the way.
Right.
They're still saying, that the Russians haven't even advanced in this area. They're trying to, but anyway, we won't waste time with what the British Ministry of Defence says, which is embarrassing, actually. But anyway, they are not the main forces that the Russians are building up. And again, we're talking about this, Alex and I, that the Ukrainians are running around like headless chickens trying to guess what the Russians are going to do. Are they going to go for Kiev? Are they going to go to Sumy? Are they thinking of advancing through the Donbass, which is the latest theory, by the way? Are they going to come through Kharkiv? Is it Zaporozhye? Are we facing a pincer movement? Are we facing a grinding operation? They don't know. We don't know. I mean, we haven't been able to work it out, and the Russians haven't told us. And do you think anybody in Washington knows? I mean, US, best intelligence system in the world. Have they any idea what the Russians are going to do?
I would say, I can't talk about current intelligence collection capabilities and what Russia has or hasn't done to shield themselves. I would say that back in the Cold War, we were very good at collecting enough data, and we had people that were extraordinarily well trained on assessing that data, that we could make very informed judgments about Soviet military capabilities, intentions, etc. It wasn't perfect, but it was okay. And what I'm saying is, if you bring that in today, and you allow a good mid-level analyst to operate free of political influence, and this is a very important part, because the political pressure that's put on the intelligence community today is unprecedented, because we have people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the President of the United States all saying what they want to happen, what they believe should happen. And the last thing the system tolerates is someone like me coming up and saying, well, boss, that ain't going to happen. The data points otherwise. There's a lot of pressure. In the old days, you could get away with it. I got away with it all the time. I mean, I don't know how many times I was called on the carpet and told by people, change your assessment. I said, no. And senior people came in and said, no, that's his job, and we have to deal with that. Today, that doesn't happen. The junior analysts who put in papers like that stay junior analysts. You don't get invited to the table unless you provide the meal that the customer wants to eat. And so I know there's people out there that know exactly what the Russians are doing. I think right now that the customer wants the truth. This is why we saw Miley. This is why we saw Burns, the CIA director. Miley met with his Ukrainian counterpart, Zaluzhny, and we saw the director meet in Kiev. And I think they're telling the Ukrainians the hard truth, that it's game, set, match, that Russia has this capability. These are the intentions of the Russians. And we don't have the ability to repeat what happened in last May, June, July, where we had the miracle of the Marne, so to speak, where this new equipment came in and we have an overextended Russians. The Russians will never make that mistake again. Ukraine will never be given the opportunity to launch that kind of spoiling attack. This is why anybody who's expecting, I think, dramatic big arrows, I think they're wrong, because the Russians know what happens. I mean, Popov's tank army, 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad, is sitting there running rampant in the German rear, but he overextended, and von Manstein launches a limited armored counterattack, pinches off, and slaughters the army. This is what happens when you overextend, even in a time of victory, especially against an enemy that is as capable as the Ukrainians are. We should never forget that point. These guys know how to fight, and if given the opportunity, they will kill Russians in large numbers. So Russia's job is not to give them that opportunity. And there's no reason for Russia to do. Note that Russia is not panicked. So whatever happens in the offensive will be well thought out. It'll be meticulous. It'll be methodical. And it'll be devastatingly deadly for the Ukrainians. And the Russians are just going to grind, advance until they accomplish what they want to accomplish, which is the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think that destruction will probably more likely resemble, again, a World War II reference, the destruction of Army Group Center, what happened after Operation Bagration in 1944, when one of the largest German army groups just disappeared because there was nothing left. And I think that's what's going to happen to the Ukrainians. There's nothing left. And we also have to remember this. There's an important component getting ready to be brought to bear on this battle that nobody's talking about. Because, the Russians have said up front, there's two things they want to accomplish. They've been consistent from day one. Demilitarization, which is happening right now, the destruction of the Ukrainian army. And I'm not talking about partial destruction. It will be total destruction. And that's what's so tragic about this, because we're talking, by the time this is done, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have died, hundreds of thousands more are going to die. That's their fate. It's sad. And remember, that also means tens of thousands of Russians are going to die. And that's their fate. It's tragic too. But denazification. And everybody's like, well, how do you denazify? You'd need to mobilize. And I've said this, if you want to occupy Ukraine, you're going to need a heck of a lot more troops than what the Russians have put together right now. The Russians have sufficient resources to do what I believe is the liberation of Novaya Russia. I believe at the end of the day, if Ukraine doesn't want to come to the table, Russia will take all of what Novaya Russia, from Odessa up to Kharkov and everything in between, will permanently become part of Russia. So sad, too bad for Ukraine. You basically made your own bed. But to accomplish this, that doesn't solve the problem of Western Ukraine. That doesn't solve the problem of Lvov. That doesn't solve the problem of Kiev. That doesn't solve the problem of Stepan Bandera and the ideology of the Banderists that's only becoming more radicalized and more mainstreamed the longer this war goes on. That's a political problem for Ukraine to solve. Now, the Russians are going to help make the Ukrainians solve that problem themselves. And I think the way they're going to do that is with a strategic air campaign. Again, we haven't seen it unfold in its totality, but we've seen the preparation of it. I mean, General Surovikin, when he was the head of the SMO, started taking out the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and it's crippled the Ukrainian economy, and it's inflicted huge harm on the Ukrainian civil society and their ability to sustain conflict. There is no Ukrainian heavy industry worthy of the name right now. But this is just the beginning. I think you're going to see, in concert with whatever big offensive occurs, a strategic air campaign that is specifically designed to destroy Ukraine as a modern nation state. It's tragic. I'm not gloating over this. It's horrible. It didn't have to be this way, but it's going to be this way, because that is the only way you're going to get the regime, which Russia has likened to a Nazi regime. So when you say denazification, understand Zelensky does not get to survive this conflict as president of Ukraine. Neither does anybody in the Rada, anybody associated with him. They all must go. And how does Russia do that without taking Kiev? By destroying Ukraine as a modern nation state, by collapsing Ukrainian society. And unfortunately, I see that that is the direction that Russia is going to go with their strategic air campaign. Putin's no longer playing games. First of all, understand this. He was betrayed in the Minsk process, and then betrayed in the Istanbul negotiation process. And the West is betraying him today. by crossing red line after red line after red line. Remember, there was a time when Joe Biden said the provision of main battle tanks to Ukraine cannot happen because that would mean World War III. Here we are giving them main battle tanks. And the only reason why it's not World War III is because of the political maturity of the Russian leadership, the only adults in the room. And they are willing, unfortunately, to suffer thousands of casualties. Imagine the burden of command that exists on Putin and his leadership to embark on a course of action that requires patience, but that patience is measured in the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of your own troops who otherwise didn't need to die that way. And you have to talk to the mothers and the fathers and the children and the grandchildren about why this happened. I mean, I couldn't even begin to comprehend the toll that takes on a human being. But the Russians have made this decision, and this is where people get wrong. And I'll leave it at this. This denigration of Vladimir Putin. I mean, I'm writing an article right now, but I'll give a little heads up on it. I compare the lies that were told about weapons of mass destruction in the lead up to the Iraq war with the lies that are told about Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is the new weapon of mass destruction in terms of the justification the West uses to carry on this conflict. Absolute bald-faced lies about the reality of the man, who he is, what he's trying to do, what he accomplishes, what he means to Russia, what he means to the world. We're being told nothing but lies. And because we don't understand him, we can't begin to comprehend what Russia wants. We continue to talk about Russia wanting to move into Europe, advance through Poland, and they don't want that. Russia wants what it has always said it wants: peace, a new European security framework that respects not only the spheres of influence of Russia, but the spheres of influence of the West, and that they find a way to bring them together, as Russia tried to do in those draft treaties. All the people that mocked those draft treaties that were submitted on December 17th of 2021, you'd pray for those treaties today. You'd crawl on your knees to have those treaties on the table today to avoid this conflict. But you missed your opportunity. You may get that opportunity again, but Russia's going to win the war first.
I think he's absolutely correct. And I think that the collapse in trust has been a profound factor which is going to affect us going forwards, because I think it's extremely unwise, just to put it mildly, to not just deceive the Russians, but to go on bragging about it, which is what Poroshenko has been doing, and Angela Merkel and Hollande have been doing it, and now Budanov. We strung them along. We didn't really mean to negotiate in March. I remember that time in March, and I can remember very well how Putin was he actually stopped the Russian advance for a whole day in order to allow an opportunity to get negotiations going. Things which I'm sure the military people must have been absolutely furious about.
Furious.
But anyway, that's what he was doing. He was giving these instructions all the time. I want to, we want to talk, we want to negotiate. And there was a moment some months ago when I realized that his perspective, this is Putin's perspective, has completely changed. And I discussed it in one of my programs, and I was wondering whether I'd got the Russian right, but Russians wrote to me and said he did absolutely. And that was the first time he made some comments which seemed to call into question the future of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian state. He seemed for the first time to say, well, look, I did what I could. I negotiated in earnest, sincerely. It didn't work. If Ukraine as a state is going to disappear, well, it wasn't because of me. It was not what I wanted. Others maneuvered it to have it happen. And I just wanted to say this, Scott, and I've just been saying this actually quite recently, which is that I think people need to ask themselves how we've got here. You discuss the cost, hundreds of thousands of people who are dead, the tens of thousands on the Russian side who are dead, the devastation of Ukraine as a country. And why? What was it all for? To prevent Donbass getting autonomy? The disproportion in the cost that Ukraine is paying for these tricks that it played, to try and avoid giving Donbass autonomy it seems staggering to me. And I think anybody who tries to justify it today really ought to go to Ukraine, or to speak to the people in Ukraine who are suffering. And maybe they would understand how completely reckless and wrong and foolish ultimately that was. Anyway, just a few things just to catch up. One of the reasons I asked you about intelligence was that I got the distinct sense that when the Russians pulled out of Kherson, and were able to do it so fast and so quickly and without losing a single man, they just pulled out, that this was something that came as a surprise, not just to the Ukrainians, but to the West as well, at least to some people in the West. They didn't expect that. Certainly the British didn't seem to expect it. I remember there was, again, a British report. It'll take them weeks to do it. It's very difficult to pull out, to retreat across a river when you're being attacked in that way. And suddenly, and they were writing all of this even after the pullback had already happened. And that did make me wonder, because I would have thought that with all the massive intelligence assets we possess nowadays, that the Russians were able to pull off that surprise. I mean, that was quite an achievement in itself. That's one thing to say. The other thing is that I think Putin and his officials, right at the start of the war, one of the factors that was perhaps affecting their judgment is I think they underestimated both the resolve of ordinary Russians, who are actually very well informed about what goes on in Ukraine, and also the resilience of the Russian economy under the sanctions pressure. And I think that was one of the factors that made the Russian government, Putin, act with a certain restraint at the beginning, as they've gradually come to realize that, in fact, the Russian economy is very resilient under these sanctions, more resilient than anybody expected, and I include myself here. And that Russian public opinion is actually very united behind this war and determined to see it through. I think this has also shifted the political calculus in Moscow a great deal. And I think we both will agree, Scott, you and I, that in fact, if you actually follow Russian politics at all, one of the things you come to understand about Putin is that within the Russian public opinion world, and even political world, Putin is a moderate. He's more moderate than most people are.
No, you're 100% correct. And not only that, he's a realist.
Yeah.
He's grounded in reality, and not prone to embracing extreme analytical models. The Russians knew sanctions were coming, and Putin, of course, had plans in place to deal with it. But any plan has a range of outcomes, possibilities, probabilities. And if you reflect on it, I mean, one of the reasons why the West was so confident in the sanctions is that there was a significant percentage of Russia, especially Moscow, Russia, St. Petersburg, Russia, that was thoroughly woven into the Western economy. And Putin would never have been able to unplug from the West on his own. If Putin had tried to unplug, there would have been a hue and cry. And also keep in mind that he wins elections by garnering 53, 56, 59% of the vote. He's not Saddam Hussein, who holds an election and wins by 99%. And the reason why I bring that up is if you've got 20, 30% of the Russian population that is thoroughly woven into the Western economic fabric, and you have a political leader that is trying to undo your livelihood, your future, your happiness, your well-being, that puts him at a political liability. And he could lose an election. He knows this. And so and then he also had the oligarch class, which he's been struggling with from day one. But the hold that the oligarch class has on or had on the Russian economy and the influence they have. Again, a full frontal assault on them could create the kind of economic flight of resources that could be fatal to Russia. So he's looking at all this saying, how do I manage this, the disentanglement of the Russian economy from the West and the oligarchs and all. And he was given the greatest gift anybody could be given. The West unplugged from Russia. And then the West destroyed the oligarchs by stealing all their assets. And Putin went, well, this just became doable because now I can recommend appropriate measures to respond to this, but it's not my fault. It's the West. And so there was no major political consequence. What happened is what happened, for instance, in Iraq when we tried to sanction the Iraqi population. The more pain we brought to the Iraqi population, the more they rallied around Saddam Hussein because blame transferal went away from their leader onto the people causing the pain. And that's what's happened in Russia too. But still, you're right. Even though he was given these opportunities, there's huge risk associated with this. And I think that the Putin and his inner circle, I think there was a lot more conservative voices. And we saw this in his speech where he was talking about the speech he gave last month, I believe. He was talking about the Russian economy. He said, it looks like we're only going to shrink by 2%. But I had some of my people, and he's looking around to his guys saying 15, 20%, which means that there were people around Putin saying, hey, boss, we have to prepare for a 15 to 20% shrinking of the economy. That's big. That's huge. And that brings with it the potential of domestic political unrest. And you combine that with bold military actions that could result in tens of thousands of dead Russians and more lost territory. And you now create the foundation for what the West is shooting for here, which is regime change. I mean, Kenneth Boghoff or
Rogoff, the economist.
Rogoff,
yeah,
the Harvard professor, G30 know-it-all, bragged at Davos. He said it's about regime change. The sanctions were designed to create regime change, and that's been the U.S. policy since 2009. I mean, people need to understand that when Barack Obama took Michael McFaul's advice and talked about a Russian reset, it wasn't a Russian reset. It was regime change, targeting Vladimir Putin to replace him with Dmitry Medvedev. I wonder if Michael McFaul's listening to what Medvedev's saying today and wondering, would that have been a good thing? Because Medvedev is a lot more rabid than Putin has ever been. But at that time, they thought that Medvedev could be controlled, contained, sort of a younger Boris Yeltsin. And that's always been the plan of the United States, is to get a Boris Yeltsin type figure back in power. And one of the ways we sought to do that was weaken Russia by stripping Ukraine away. That's hence 2008, the invitation of Ukraine. Now, initially, I think that was designed to achieve regime change without destroying Ukraine. But at some point in time, the policy became, we're going to use Ukraine as a vehicle to weaken Russia, and we don't care about the fate of Ukraine. And that's the tragedy. Russia is the only nation that actually cares about the fate of Ukraine. But Putin had to be careful. You alluded to it. That, this is growth. And sometime in, I would say, the September timeframe, September, October, November timeframe, Putin underwent, because I think even when they did the mobilization, I don't think Putin was thinking about total defeat of Ukraine. He was thinking about, how do we manage, how do we mitigate this problem? How do I move forward? I can't move forward too boldly. So he's being very patient. But then the economic reality started to come in, the success. It wasn't going to be as bad. We don't have to fear sanctions as much. The Chinese, the Indians, and the world stood up to the plate. They were still worried, though, what would be the impact of total closure of Europe buying, the price cap, et cetera. A lot of uncertainty, but it looks like Russia has done far better than any of the energy security experts in the West ever predicted. And I can say that because I work for an energy security outlet, and they continue to believe that Russia is going to suffer some sort of detrimental economic impact down the road. I don't think so. I think Russia's
No.
solved this particular problem economically. Politically, look, was the mobilization of 300,000 a risk? Sure, especially given the fact that Russia had to go, as Valery Gerasimov said, we had to kick the rust off a system that hadn't been exercised in a long time. And there were a lot of mistakes made, a lot of lessons learned, though. And in the end, they mobilized these 300,000. And a lot of people denigrate these guys. They're like, they're reservists. They don't want to fight. Gosh, I remember there was an American army back in World War II that didn't want to fight either. People tend to forget that we mobilized 12 million, draftees. And if you had given them any choice, they would have said, I'm staying home. I don't want to go fight in Italy and Germany or Japan. Maybe Japan because of Pearl Harbor. But in Europe, there wasn't huge enthusiasm about this conflict. They would have liked to stay home. But then came North Africa, the initial blooding, then Sicily, and then Anzio. And suddenly we had an American army, and Rick Atkinson has written about this brilliantly, his trilogy about the army, how we took these draftees and we transformed them into an army of killers, stone cold killers, who realized the quickest way home was through the bodies of the Germans you had to lay to waste. Now, I say that these 300,000 Russians, they're cut from the same piece of cloth. These are guys who did their time. They served their country. They were home. They had jobs. They had families. They didn't want to go to war. It wasn't their thing. But now they've been called to do it. And like the Americans, they began to recognize they're fighting evil, pure evil. Anybody who doesn't think that this Ukrainian regime isn't pure evil, you're wrong. Any regime that breathes life into the odious ideology of Stepan Bandera is pure evil, literally the personification of evil. And we recognized, the Americans back then recognized Adolf Hitler's Germany as pure evil. And we waded through them. We slaughtered them and we beat them. The quickest way home for these 300,000 reservists who were mobilized is through the bodies of the Ukrainians they're getting ready to slaughter, not because they wanted to, but because they've been given no other choice. These guys are ready for war. And more importantly, the people they left behind are ready for war. The families aren't sitting there saying, woe is me, why are we at war? They're saying, my God, we're at war, get the job done. It's not, I don't want to be too extreme here, but with your shield or on your shield, baby. Come home with your shield or on your shield, because that's the only thing that we're going to tolerate as a society. The Russians are in it to win. There's no other nation on this planet today, not even the Ukrainians, that are that committed to this conflict. Yeah. The Russians are in it to win. And this is why you have to respect that. Doesn't mean it's going to be a piece of cake. It's not. But the Russians are ready to do what's necessary to win this conflict. And tragically for the people of Ukraine, they are going to win. It is going to mean the destruction of the Ukrainian military, hundreds of thousands of more deaths, and probably the end of Ukraine as a modern nation state.
Which is a tragic thing. Just a few things to say there. I mean, the first thing on the mobilization, the Russian mobilization. I mean, Zelensky himself has said it was a success. I mean, if the leader of Ukraine, the Ukrainian military says, that the Russian mobilization succeeded, I mean, I don't really see why we should go around and disagree with him on something like that. And I found it actually very impressive that Gerasimov, who is the head of the Russian General Staff, has said, that there were problems, and that the Russian media were talking about the problems all the way through the mobilization. I thought that was, by the way, extremely good politics. It was not trying to hide everything. You talk about it straightforwardly, and it showed confidence that this process would actually be carried through successfully. I mean, I worked in government. I know how, the temptation is always to hide things. So the fact that they didn't was actually, it was an impressive feat. And of course, if they need to do it again, they'll do it better.
Well, this is the most important point, believe it or not, because of what the West did. Here's two very important points. The Russian military, first of all, has expanded. Putin has signed an order expanding the Russian military to 1.5 million men. And the bulk of the growth is going to come from what I call expeditionary forces. Marines, brigades are going to be turned into divisions. Airborne brigades will be turned into divisions. And these are important because they're not tied to specific geographical regions. These are forces that are designed to be, I mean, some of the Marine brigades, yes, they're committed to, the Northern Fleet, the Baltic Fleet, etc. But we see Baltic Fleet Marines are down in Ukraine right now fighting. And we have the paratroopers there. These are the elite shock troops, and they're not light infantry. They have tanks, they have artillery, they're conventional forces capable of going toe-to-toe with anything the United States has. They're expanding a new group outside. I mean, Sweden and Finland, A, they're never going to be members of NATO. Turkey just made sure of that. But B, the stupidity of NATO, because now Russia is building an army group opposite them. And whoa, there you are. Peace and security, no, on Russian terms now. But Russia's doing that. But it's not just the expansion, it's the reorganization. At the end of the Cold War, Russia did away with the Soviet era, battalion, regiment, division, corps. They went to, brigades that were designed to crank out 2 or 3 what they call battalion tactical groups. And these were small combined arms formations. They were designed to deal with limited combat situations, but not large-scale ground warfare in Europe. The Russians invaded Ukraine using the battalion tactical group methodology. If you remember all the intelligence guys, they got 100 BTGs, they got 120 BTGs. I mean, sort of, it's like a BTU. They got a BTG. How many BTGs can we burn through? Da, 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 da. Well, the Russians have looked at the BTG concept and went insufficient to the task. That's sort of what's happened here. The Russians have learned an awful lot. Insufficient to the task. And what have they done in this period of time when they brought up the 300,000? Those 300,000 aren't being formed into BTGs. They're being formed into regiments, which support divisions, which now bring in the doctrine of large-scale ground combat using combined arms formations. That's the new Russian army. And the new Russian army has the best equipment in the world. I know people are out there talking about the Leopard 2 and the Challenger 2 and the Abrams. I don't know what is it, Abrams 1, A2, A3. Who knows what the numbers are? It doesn't matter, because for the last 20 years, Western military thinkers whose thought gets attached to the procurement people who are designing the weapons needed to build a military that's meeting the national security strategy had been singularly focused on the Middle East, Central Asia, low-intensity conflict. Armored divisions in America sort of just flittered away. We would deploy armored divisions to Iraq and Afghanistan without their tanks because we didn't need the tanks there. While we're doing that, the Russians, since 2008, a lot of people don't talk about the 5-day war the Russians had with the Georgians. The Russians got the snot kicked out of them by Georgian light infantry, who were trained, by the way, by the Marine Corps. And we trained them in very effective fire maneuver, and they were maneuvering, they were communicating, they were doing well. The problem is there wasn't enough of them. They didn't have any tanks. And so the Russians came in with mass and pushed them aside. But the Russians went, holy cow, had this been a real NATO force, we might not have won. In fact, we probably would have lost. So from 2008 till 2014, Russia radically transformed its military, emphasizing contract forces, professional forces, and getting their new equipment, new communications equipment, new field gear, et cetera. And we saw them, the little green men that were running around Crimea, different caliber of troop than what was running around Georgia in 2008. But even then, that wasn't out. 2016, Russia breathes life back into the moribund First Guards Tank Army and 20th Guards Combined Arms Army, which are, of course, Cold War formations designed to carry out large-scale offensive operations. But even then, they kept the brigade structure, BTGs. Russia now is going through another iteration. This, like the caterpillar, just keeps morphing, and they've morphed again into a force that is totally dedicated for closing with and destroying a NATO-style army and large-scale ground combat. The T-90 tank is designed to destroy everything in the NATO inventory. Anybody who thinks that Ukraine's suddenly going to get this stuff that it can't maintain, doesn't know how to operate, forget all that. Let's say it comes in perfectly. Everything works perfectly. It never breaks down. You're still not going to beat the Russians because every weapon in their arsenal has been designed with the intent of destroying exactly that same equipment. We can't say the same of the Russian equipment. Will a T-90 tank blow up? Absolutely. That's been proven. But it also survives a lot of things that we are surprised that it survives. It has a gun and it has main tank ammunition specifically designed to defeat the Abrams tank with the depleted uranium armor. And we're not giving that to the Ukrainians. We're giving them the steel armor, which means you might as well just say, hey, all you guys in there, and it used to be just 3 bodies, but now it's going to be 4 because the Abrams has a crew of 4. So there's going to be additional dead Ukrainian, but everybody goes in there. Just write your letters before you get inside, because the moment you move that tank to the front line, it will be destroyed. The same thing with the Leopard, same thing with the Challenger. None of these tanks will survive any major engagement with their Russian counterparts. The Russians are organized, equipped, trained to kill these people. These people have no clue what they're getting ready to tangle with.
Do you get the impression, because I'm increasingly getting the impression, Scott, that the militaries in the West are ringing the alarm bells? I say that because, can I just first of all say, I mean, one of the things you've been saying for years, not just recently, long before this war, about the extent to which NATO armies have withered away. This has been demonstrated vividly. We've seen that with the German army. They've come up with all kinds of admissions about this. There's just been comments about the state of the British Army. And I don't know whether you're up to date with this, but we had Sir Patrick Sanders, who was our top general, say 14 tanks to Ukraine is going to cause a major weakening of our military. That's 14. I mean, not 400 or just 14. We don't have 400 tanks. We've got about 150 of them, and not all of them in particularly good shape, apparently.
Right. How many of those can actually start?
Exactly. And there's just been a report that, perhaps in 5-10 years, we might be able to put a division together. 5-10 years, a division of 25,000 men. I mean, we are in a terrible state in the British military, something I had not appreciated myself to the extent that we are. But do you get the sense that the militaries in Germany, in Britain, but first and foremost in the United States, are now trying to signal to the political leaders, this has gone too far, this is going wrong, we're throwing away a lot of our equipment in this bonfire, which is Ukraine. Ukraine can't win. We're not weakening the Russians. You've just described how the Russians are cranking out more divisions, cranking out more regiments, building up their military. We've discussed the economics, that the economy, in fact, is not contracting in Russia. It's, in fact, probably going to expand this year, whereas in Germany, we're probably in recession, and in Britain, by the way, we definitely are. So do you get the sense that the militaries, that Miley, that all of those people are quietly telling or trying to get the political leaders to understand that this isn't going right, that there is no actual military victory to be won for Ukraine in this war?
I believe so. I believe that message is being broadcast. I mean, we saw the Germans had to go public about it because their politicians were getting so far ahead of reality that the German military has come out and said, we're naked. We got nothing, literally nothing. Nothing works. I mean, they've got 1 battalion's worth of Leopard A2 or Leopard 2 A7s, which is their most modern version. That's on rotation to every other battalion in the German army, because there's only 1 battalion's worth. So to train your other battalions, you have to get that. The other A6s don't work, so they gin up another battalion worth to be the OP4. So you have tanks being moved around. So on paper, it says, we got 6 German armored battalions? No, you don't. You don't. They had to cannibalize everything to get that armored task force up to Lithuania. And again, just the mindset, German tanks in Lithuania to go against the Russians. I mean, the only thing dumber than that is sending German tanks to Ukraine to fight the Russians. I mean, Germany has forgotten its history. And I mean, maybe people need to re-educate them about the Morgenthau plan and what should have happened to the Ruhr area, and the fact that Rheinmetall AG, that's producing Leopard tanks, probably shouldn't have been allowed to exist because of this very reason. But that's a different question altogether. That's just my little personal animosity against the successors of Nazi Germany, who've tended to forget their history. But the fact is, let's look at the U.S. military. Probably man for man, one of the most competent militaries on the planet. Very well trained, Not as well trained as they should be because, again, they've been fittered away for 20 years, killing wedding parties and kicking down doors of villagers. But now they're trying to get refocused. So let's say we get an armored division in Poland. So we're going to have 2 heavy armored brigades, and we're going to have a mechanized brigade, probably some Bradleys thrown in there, probably some Strykers. But now we're going to move in on the Russians. Day one, our tanks in the initial meeting engagement will perform well. Our guys are well trained. The tanks will take out some Russian vehicles, but in doing so, they'll expose their position. And then the reality comes in because that brigade has 18 self-propelled artillery pieces. First of all, the Russians are going to take out those 18 the second they fire. Then the Russians are going to strip away the infantry cover from these tanks with more artillery than we've ever experienced in our entire life. And suddenly the tanks are going to be operating naked. We're going to try and bring in helicopters to support them, but we've never gone against the integrated air defense that we're going to be dealing with. So the helicopters are going to be either being shot down or fleeing for their lives. Same thing with close air support. They're going to be too busy trying to figure out how to recover down pilots than they are to actually provide support. So this tank on the ground with well-trained people is now in a battle. Pop, he gets the first T-90. Pop, boom, 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 boom. He's hit with 7 rounds. He's dead. Now, when he goes, he loses flank protection for the next tank, who now has to start to withdraw, but can't. Bop, it's dead. It becomes a rout. The best armored brigade in the world cannot survive a modern large-scale ground combat. And when it's wiped out, there's nothing left. There's no reserves to come in. It's gone. And this is the reality of the war. The U.S. Army cannot survive more than 3 days in a war against Russian forces in Europe. One, we don't have the logistics. How are we going to get all that jet fuel that all those M1 Abrams need? How are we going to get them to the front lines? This ain't Iraq. You don't put them in a convoy with a bunch of cops running up the road and daring a couple insurgents to hit an IED. This is going against the Russians. They will slaughter that convoy before it gets out of whatever logistics base that's going to be slaughtered too. Let me introduce you to the Iskander. Let me introduce you to the Caliber. Let me introduce you to the Kinzhal, missiles that you can't shoot down that will take out every piece of your infrastructure. And now your guys are up front. And again, history shows the tank is moving forward and it runs out of gas. It is a coffin, literally a coffin. They'll run out of ammunition. They'll run out of gas. They'll run out of everything, spare parts. How do you maintain the most difficult tank in the world to maintain when it breaks down, when you're going up against the Russians who are destroying everything? Because we don't have the artillery to hit back. We got HIMARS. Not enough. Not enough. And guess what, America? We just introduced the Russians to HIMARS. And the Russians went, well, okay, that's a system. It hurts. It stings. We've lost a lot of guys. Adapt and overcome. They now have a counter HIMARS strategy. So whatever tactical advantage we thought we were going to have by bringing HIMARS up is gone. And you know what else they don't fear? The M777. Turned out to be the joke I always said it was. People have to remember, I wrote about it back in June. I said, don't give them the M777. It breaks. It breaks. It breaks. It breaks. It's not as good as you think it is. And the ones that aren't getting hit by the Russian Lancet drones, they're breaking. And when they break in Ukraine, you don't have a bunch of guys coming in on a deuce and a half, jumping off with the spare parts, pumping up with nitrogen, replace the part, get it back up and running. You got to remove it all the way back to Germany, where American depot fixes it, and it takes time. And then you got to bring it back. And all that movement opens up to even further interdiction. And the American Army is the best one Europe's got. The German Army can't fight, can't get out of barracks. It is literally a joke. The French Army, incapable of deploying outside of France without American airlift support. And even then, it's just the light armor. They can't move their heavy stuff. Germany, Europe, they did an exercise because we've been going in and doing it's the new version of Reforger. But one of the things we found is Europe's infrastructure is not conducive to the large scale movement of military materiel. First of all, everything's going to be sort of confined to trains or rail lines. If you think those rail lines are going to survive the first day, think again. Then there's bridges. There's only a number of bridges that can handle the weight that we're talking about. They'll be taken out. So all these reserves that are supposed to flow towards the front line ain't going to flow. Just they're not going to flow. Meanwhile, Russia is operating on interior lines of communication with well thought out plans, bridges that can take it, equipment that can actually travel off-road, the movement of forces compared, the actual strategic mobility potential of these parties is there's no comparison. What do we talk about? The Baltics? Really? We want to talk about the Baltics? I forget what was the country, Estonia or Latvia is going to hold their major mobilization of 600 men. Well, there you go. You know how many 600 men doesn't even give you a half a day in Bakhmut. Okay. So, no, thank you. The Baltics, Poland has an army of 164,000 right now. Maybe 40,000 are good troops. The rest, no, they're not. They don't. The same thing with the rest of Europe. Can't fight. They want to go to 300,000, but the Polish army is shrinking by 4,500 men per month. Good luck with that, Poland. And the Italians. Never mind. We don't even want to talk about the Italians. So there's the British army. I don't mean to pick on them. They used to be well-trained individuals. Not anymore. I think even the British acknowledge that they've lost the edge. But, the World Cup, they had the great World Cup in Qatar, and you saw those big stadiums where the games were played. You could put the entire British Army in one of those stadiums and still have 20 to 30,000 empty seats. Mm-hmm. The British Army is nothing. It's a joke, literal joke. And this is supposed to take on the Russians. And the Russians, remember, aren't shrinking. They just expanded to 1.5 million. And it's not just that they've expanded. Their defense industry is in a near wartime production mode without any meaningful impact on the civilian industry. They are pumping out 20, 30, 40 T-90 tanks a month. In addition to the modernized T-72, the T-80s, artillery, you name it. The Russians are just cranking this stuff out. And it's good stuff. It's good stuff. The West has made a fatal mistake here because NATO will never be able to match this expansive Russian military. Stoltenberg back in Madrid in June talked about 300,000 rapid response force. As soon as he opened it, I went, what? Where are you getting these? Because the last time I checked, NATO doesn't print troops like America prints money. The troops actually come from the constituent members who actually have things called parliamentary bodies that actually have to approve this stuff, fund it, then they have to train it and make it available to NATO. And the Germans were going, what, you want us to take that battalion that we already stole everything to make a battalion? You want to turn it to a brigade? We can't do it. The British did the same thing. You said, the British think in 15 years they could have a division? Well, they can't get a brigade right now, and they want to turn that British battalion into a brigade? No. I mean, the only one that can generate brigades is America, but we're out of brigades to generate because our army has shrunk. We spend $800 billion a year, but our army's actually getting weaker and weaker and weaker every year because we're not buying new equipment for the army, because we're not doing the maintenance that's required, because we don't have pre-positioned equipment. I mean, we have Cold War mentality that somehow thinks that this is the 1980s when we could surge 250,000 troops in 10 days to marry up a pre-positioned equipment that were combat ready because we spent billions of dollars every year maintaining this equipment, making sure it was ready for moments, use it a momentary thing. We don't have that anymore. We literally don't have that. So, but the Russians do. The Russians are getting ready for the big one. And we're sitting here, talk. I bring up that line from, one of my favorite movies, Top Gun. Son, your mouth's writing checks your body can't cash. And that's literally what NATO's doing. Stoltenberg opens his mouth and people should just punch it and shut it forever. Baerbock opens her mouth. Never punch a woman, but please ask her to be quiet. Anybody who speaks now, who is the Dutch admiral just came out, the director of the NATO military council. Just came out and he's like, we are ready for a war. You're not ready for anything, dude. You couldn't even get your guys out of garrison. I mean, this is a joke. You'd think it's a Monty Python movie. It's so bad, but it's not. It's sad. It's sad because here's the thing. And people sometimes think that because I articulate a stance that's analytically supportive of what Russia's doing, that somehow I have it out for Ukraine. I don't at all. My heart breaks for what's happening. This is the death of a nation. This is the death of a society. This is death of people, human beings, mothers, children, sons, grandfathers, fathers, uncles, aunts. They are dying right now and they are suffering. And the only people to blame is the collective West, the United States, everybody who has allowed this nation to be sacrificed in the sick cause of trying to defeat and dismember Russia. And what is the crime Russia has committed? They had a president who stood up in 1999 and said, I will not allow my nation to be destroyed by the West. We will no longer play the role of submissive, colonial, pathetic pet to the Western economic rape that's taking place. We refuse to play that game anymore. But he didn't say, I want to compete with the West. He just simply said, I want Russia to rise up and live. And we can't even allow Russia to do that. And we're willing to sacrifice Ukraine for this perverted cause. I dream about war crime tribunals someday, and I'd love to have Michael McFaul up there, and I'd love to have Barack Obama, and I'd love to have every single one of these people who have allowed the United States to embrace these horrific Fiona Hill. We can go on, all what I call the Putin whisperers, all these so-called Russian experts who have built their resumes on nothing other than articulating the same tired argument that Vladimir Putin is a dictatorial autocrat. He is not. That Russia is a expansive imperialistic power. It is not. Go to Russia, visit Russia, meet the Russian people. You'll fall in love with them because they're good people. It's a good country. They have a solid history. They have great culture. They have a religion that they believe in. I don't say that I'm Orthodox and all that, but they believe in it, and you have to respect that. You have to respect their faith. You have to respect their history, respect their culture, respect them as people. And we don't. We don't. All the things we demand of us as Americans. You have to respect us as Americans. Okay, earn it. Earn it. What have we done for the last decades? We've destroyed ourselves morally by engaging in illegal wars of occupation and aggression throughout the Middle East. We've destroyed our reputation by not standing for anything, especially arms control. We've withdrawn from all the treaties that matter. We lie about the one treaty that remains. We are literally the epitome of all that one could say could possibly be wrong with the country. And we don't even begin to talk about what we see on the streets here. I can go 5 minutes right now and find hundreds of homeless people in the streets of Albany, and that's nothing to compare to what's going on in the big cities around this country. I can find entire neighborhoods that are boarded up because of poverty, because of drugs, because of the fear that's brought by a society that doesn't care for them. They've been abandoned by the American dream. And yet we have the gall to lecture Russia for standing up and rebuilding a country that we destroyed in the 1990s. It sickens me. It sickens me. You know, I'm not going to pretend that Russia's perfect. It's not. Find a Russian who'll tell you it's perfect. They won't. Russians are like anybody else. They can tell you what needs to be fixed, but they love their country and they have a reason to love their country. It's a country worth loving. Unlike what's going on right now, we are sacrificing Ukraine. And again, I'm going to get emotional, but it breaks my heart.
Can I ask, because a question I've often wondered, which is about why is Ukraine fighting the war in the way that it is fighting it? Why are they holding on to every millimeter of territory in the way that they are? Why are they going for these extraordinary counteroffensives? Is it because Zelensky is overrated? Is it because he doesn't know what his job is? I mean, he's apparently been advised by the US, by the military of the US, to pull back from Bakhmut. He's apparently reinforcing Bakhmut. I mean, he's doing things that I, as somebody, a total civilian, I don't understand. Why is Ukraine fighting this war in this particular way, maximizing their own casualties, causing this terrible distress to their own people? Why are they fighting it like this?
Well, I think we need to be honest and say that had the United States not led the collective West, to use the term that Russia has used, it's an accurate term, to mobilize in support of Ukraine, Ukraine would have lost this war last summer because the Ukrainian military was being ground down to nothing. I said in June that I thought that they had suffered over 200,000 dead, and I believe my numbers are accurate. And they had suffered, additional wounded, and their equipment had been ground down to nothing. All these tanks and everything that they had, it's gone. But we breathed life into them. But that life comes with a cost. Let's remember, Lloyd Austin, when he came back in May from Kiev and he spoke in Moscow, said straight up, he didn't say we're trying to get the Ukrainians to win. He said we want to inflict pain on Russia. All right. So that's and right there, every Ukrainian should have went, what? Lindsey Graham, we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. Every Ukrainian should have said, what? I thought we were trying to fight for the last inch of Ukrainian soil. I thought we were trying to fight for Ukrainian sovereignty. I thought we were trying to fight for territorial integrity. But you're telling me that all you want me to do is inflict pain on Russia so that Russia would never again seek to do what they're doing to us right now? And there's the problem. Zelensky is the guy that has to maintain the facade of the potential of Ukrainian victory in order to continue to receive the money. See, if Zelensky actually listened to his military officers and did what was militarily viable to preserve the combat power of the Ukrainian military, eventually Zelensky would have to acknowledge that they don't have sufficient resources to accomplish what they want. They need to sue for peace. Because there's no Ukrainian general who's going to tell you we can. I mean, Zelensky has to play the political game. Give me all this. Give me a new army, and I can attack Melitopol, 84 kilometers through the Russian lines, and threaten, sever the land bridge and threaten Crimea. I can do all this stuff. I mean, God, hey, Zelensky, I can do it too. I can make my hands do this. Doesn't mean that I'm a fighter ace. And I can sit there and draw arrows. It doesn't mean that I'm a damn general. Stop drawing arrows. Be honest. And he said, if you don't give me this, I can't win. But what he's really saying is, I can't win. I can't win. But he can't say that because the second you say that, you don't get the equipment. And if you don't get the equipment, you really can't win. You're going to die right now. So there's this fight going on inside Ukraine between the Zelensky crowd. And I forget, there's a term that the Ukrainians use. It's a street that the presidential power Bankova. Yes, Bankova. So it's a battle between Bankova and Zelensky, and it's a big political battle taking place. And the Ukrainian army knows that if they don't bend to the political will, then they don't get the equipment they need to survive. So there's this trade-off that's being played right here. But at some point in time, I think, and you're starting to see that. You're starting to see the West realize that if they continue to push Zelensky, the hope that Russia would collapse is gone. I mean, Kenneth Rogoff aside, nobody believes anymore that sanctions are going to bring about regime change in Russia. I mean, he might, but then again, he's paid by Harvard. So, sorry, Harvard. But, nobody believes that. And nobody believes now that the Russian people are going to somehow collapse because of the weight of the reality of war. So the hope for what Zelensky was always hoping for was what they call the Moscow Maidan. And that was a big theory that going on in Kiev, the Moscow Maidan, that through economic sanctions, and if we can just hold out, if we can just fight for every inch, make Russia bleed for every gain, we make it look like Russia can't win, because that's what they're doing. They're pouring all these troops in so that Russia doesn't create the inevitability of victory. The longer you can delay the Russians, the longer you can bleed the Russians, the more hope there is that the Russian people will rise up, but they're not. And they bled themselves dry now in this vain hope of a Moscow Maidan. And so now we're at a moment where that dream is gone, shattered. And the West, and again, it's a dream that we believed in. It's a dream that General Austin believed in. Remember, we want to bring pain to the Russians. We want to hurt them. Why? The goal has always been regime change. Regime change fantasies are gone. Everybody's now starting, and you see it throughout Europe. We have to start talking about how we're going to live with Russia, how we're going to deal with Putin. These are things they weren't talking about early on because there's the assumption that Russia's gone. The economy will collapse. The people will rise up. Putin will be removed. That fantasy's gone, guys. Now they're all saying, how do we deal with Russia? Well, the way you deal with Russia is you're going to have to acknowledge defeat, and the defeat is going to be dramatic. And at some point in time, I think you're going to see, and you already see the preparation. I mean, you see it in the way the media is treating Zelensky and Zelensky. More and more deference is being given to General Zelensky and to the Minister of Defense, whose name I can't remember again.
Reznikov.
Yes, Reznikov. And they're both being elevated here. Although you see the counterattack from Zelensky with the corruption charges designed to bring it down. And you saw how Zelensky, the miracle million. Zelensky, when everybody else is being accused of corruption, he receives $1 million inheritance from somebody, and he gives it away to charity because he's such a pure soul. I mean, there's funny political games being played right there, but the West, I think, is starting to put pressure on Ukraine to accept reality. And I think it's going to come down to, and I've talked about this elsewhere, and I know you guys might not agree with me on this one. A lot of people don't, but I call it the Odessa moment. I think Russia, this campaign is going to be designed to secure the Donbass and secure Russia. By Russia, I mean Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass, because that is all Russia. To secure it, that means to take back all that territory that is Russia, that's under occupation. They say illegal occupation of the Ukrainians, and then to push further to keep the Ukrainians out of artillery range, and in the process destroy the Ukrainian military. I also believe that Kharkov is at risk. I think that in order to secure Lugansk, you can't allow Kharkov to exist as a Ukrainian entity. So Kharkov is at risk, and they'll be pushing further into Sumy. They're going to do all that. They have forces sufficient to that task because they'll be destroying the Ukrainian military in the process. And then there's going to come a point in time, I believe sometime in midsummer, where Russia will have accomplished this, and they're going to pivot, and they're going to be looking towards Odessa, and Ukraine will have nothing left to defend. And then the Russians are going to pause, and they're going to give Ukraine one chance. And they're going to say, you know, whatever formula they come up, because some people disagree with me by letting Odessa remain Ukrainian because of the history of what happened, et cetera. But there'll be some sort of pause that says your last chance at being an economically viable nation state is continued access to the sea. But to get this, you have to surrender on our terms right now. At that point in time, I think they're setting up Zelensky or somebody to pop Zelensky in the head and take over and say, we accept those terms. But if they don't, it'll be a rapid campaign sweeping through Odessa, linking up with Transnistria, because you got to solve the Transnistria problem. You got to solve that problem. And they'll do that. And then it's over. And I think that's done by early fall. I don't think the battle for Odessa is going to be long. I don't think the battle for southern Ukraine is going to take that long at all. But because there won't be anything left of the Ukrainian military, it will be all gone. There's no resistance capable. But I do think there will be that pause, and I think Russia needs to do that pause politically, because, you know, Putin, again, you get it. You're one of the few people that gets it, that says straight up, the man wants peace. The man doesn't. This is killing him, what's going on in Ukraine, and it's killing the Russians. We in the West don't get it because we apparently have lost our heart. We've lost compassion. But this war is killing these Russians because they don't want to kill the Ukrainians. It's breaking his heart. And I think that he will do what many people, you know, all of us armchair warriors who sit back here, hell no, take Odessa, finish them off, kill them. I think Putin, the humanist, is going to sit there and wipe away a tear and say, no, stop, give him a chance, give him one last chance. And, you know, there was an interesting interview that I just saw with the Ukrainian politician that had his face pockmarked. I can't remember.
Yushchenko.
Yes, he did an interview, and he was talking about a discussion he had with Putin. But it was amazing because what he was describing was a man who came into a cabin and warmed his hands on the fire and talked about the tiles. And he said, could I, you know, they talked about, could he get a set of these tiles so he could build a Ukrainian stove in his home that he's building? This is a man. This isn't a machine. This is a man with a heart, a man with a sense of history, with a sense of moral responsibility, with compassion. And that man, I think, is going to give Ukraine one last chance to survive, one last chance. But who knows? Because I draw that upon that interview he had with the Hungarian journalist back during the Valdai conference, when he alluded to Odessa as either being the key for peaceful resolution or the end of Ukraine. But as you have acknowledged, a lot has transpired since that time, and Putin seems to have hardened his stance. So my Odessa moment may actually be derived in a past that's no longer relevant, that Russia may have made an even harder decision that will just sweep through and do all that. I don't know what the future is, except to say that this war ends on Russia's terms and only Russia's terms.
Can I just say, in support, in reinforcement of what you just said, I have had many emails from Russians who tell me, you know, it's very, very difficult for us to wage this war. People talk about us, waging an unconstrained bombing war, for example. Very difficult for us to do that in Ukraine, because for us, even if not for the Ukrainians, we remain a fraternal people. Now, you may find that sentimental or romantic perspective, but I still think a lot of Russians hold to it. And of course, an awful lot of Russians continue to have familial connections with
Ukraine.
And that's, yeah, exactly. And that's not to be underestimated. That's not something, to be disregarded. There is strange to say this, an element of civil war about this conflict, which I think people perhaps don't quite understand, at least maybe not for you from the Ukrainian side, but certainly from the Russian. Can I ask you about the...
Yeah, sure.
No, go on.
I just want to say one thing just to reinforce that. You got to be careful of videos you see on Telegram and everything, because they're cherry picking all this stuff. But over and over again, I've seen videos that appear to be legitimate close quarters combat, trench clearing. And as somebody who was trained in the art of clearing trenches, fortunately never had to do it for real, so purely training, I will just tell you right now that if you, as any Marine unit that I would be involved in, assaults through a trench line, there will not be a single living person. Meaning that if we see something move, we kill it. If there's a bunker, a grenade goes in, we follow through with fire. We kill anything that moves, twitches, whatever, especially if we're being subjected to continuing effective fire from the enemy or potential counterattack. There will be no prisoners taken, not because we're war criminals. We're just not going to give you a chance to surrender, because it's our lives on the line. And I care about my Marines more. I care about the people in the trench. So it's kill them all, push through. If they're wounded later on and we recover them wounded, we'll treat them well. We'll hold them back. But the idea of hands up, I'm surrendering. I'm sorry. You don't get the chance to put your hands up because you're in a trench opposing me. You're going to die. But over and over again, I see these Russians going in there, begging the Ukrainians to surrender, begging them to surrender, begging them, giving them every opportunity, exposing themselves to the kind of stuff I couldn't even imagine. There was one where 3 guys actually had 5 Ukrainians down on the ground while they're being attacked, and they have to go deal with the attack, and they just tell them, stay there, don't move. And they're leaving weapons near them. And I'm like, no, no, you don't do that. You kill them because they represent a threat to you. They're the enemy. They're trying to kill you. But the Russians don't do that because that's their brother. That's their cousin. That's literally their blood. And we don't get it. We just don't get it, how compassionate these people are. I'm not saying that the Russians are incapable of cruelty. Of course they are, like anybody else. But systemically, it's one of the most compassionate societies in the world, especially when we're talking about Ukraine. And that's why this war hurts them so much, because they know who's responsible for this. They know who brought this on. And it's not the Ukrainians, at least not the Ukrainian people, and it's not their government. Anyways, I apologize for that. I just thought...
No, don't apologize at all. Always very welcome. I just wanted to turn now to this RAND report which we had, which is actually very, very interesting, because first of all, I think if you could explain to people what RAND is and what it does, because this isn't something I think most people understand. I'm not sure I fully understand it myself, actually. But anyway, this is something certainly from within the establishment of the power structures of the United States. First admission that a long war in Ukraine should be avoided. It's not working out for the United States. And of course, it's all coded. There's lots of, language. It doesn't want to stray too far from the orthodoxies. But when you drill through, what they're basically saying is, bring this war to an end. Do it as fast as you possibly can, because it's not going well for you. And then, of course, we've had this report by this body, the CSIS. Alex remembers what that stands for. I've already forgotten. But anyway, they talk about the fact that our military industries in the United States are under great strain. We're struggling to keep up. Where our supplies are getting depleted. And then, of course, IMF, sanctions are not working. The Russian economy is going to grow. As we said just before we started this program, if you think all of these reports have come out simultaneously and it's just an accident, I don't believe in these kind of accidents. That's my own personal view. Does all this, are all of these reports a further sign that the doubts in Washington are beginning to grow?
Yeah, I think, let's take a step back. First of all, you asked what is RAND. RAND stands for Research and Development, RAND. And it's a corporation that was created, sort of a think tank that was created in support of the United States Air Force back in the 50s, to help do things such as sustain the notion of a bomber gap, to sustain the notion of a missile gap, to talk about, this is one of their big things was, no new Pearl Harbor. That's what the whole missile gap was. We can't allow Pearl Harbor again. They brought in this great thinker whose name I can't remember right now, and he wrote a paper about it. But the bottom line is, it was used by the Air Force to promote an intellectual foundation of thought that was designed to influence political leaders into funding programs that the military wanted. And then RAND has grown beyond. Remember this, RAND doesn't write anything for the benefit of intellectual development. RAND only writes things to service the customer. And the customer has grown from the U.S. Air Force to the U.S. government. Now let's go further back. People keep talking about the deep state, the deep state this, the deep state that. I don't want to get too conspiratorial here, but I do want to say that from the very beginning, Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us all about this, the military-industrial complex and its connectivity with Congress, which is all about money. And he said, if you let this capture, America, then democracy is at risk. And it is, totally. So what RAND is part of this. The people in RAND are people that come up from the establishment and therefore are acceptable to the establishment. RAND can only be listened to by Congress if RAND is seen as a credible resource. And remember, RAND transcends political administrations. RAND is not Democratic. RAND is not Republican. RAND is the defense industry. So is CSIS. So is all these others. IMF is sort of the economic version of that, because IMF exists to formulate and implement policies that are to the benefit of American national security strategy. That's it. And American national security strategy is not defined by a single administration. It's defined by an establishment that is transferred from one administration to the other. That's the deep state. That's it. And RAND is the deep state. If you go in and take the names of the people that write these reports, you will see that they all have either they're a byproduct of the government experience or what I call the militarized academic experience. What I mean by militarized academic experience is, again, I actually spent a lot of time doing this. I was going to write a big paper, but the people that were going to publish it didn't want me to publish it because it's too controversial. But basically, I studied the major PhD producing institutions in America related to Russian area studies. And you take a look at the thesis advisors, and you take a look at the people that are getting their PhDs, and you take a look at where they go and how their PhDs support it. And you see that it's the total perversion of academia, that the academic system exists only to produce experts capable of populating the deep state to meet the establishment criteria of promoting a strictly defined notion of what the American national security should be. So here we have RAND in 2019 publishes a paper that says, I forget the exact name of it, but the notion was, how do we kick Russia's butt? How do we destroy Russia? What can we do? The 7 strategies to weaken Russia and tear it down and eliminate it as a modern nation state. That's pretty much what the paper was. And one of the big ones was Ukraine. Strip Ukraine away. And this drove, people going, well, it's just an academic paper. No, it's RAND. And it was written because somebody said, we need to convince Congress, we need to convince the rest of the establishment. It's like when people talk about the New York Times in the old days. If it led on the New York Times, it sort of dominated the news cycle. RAND dominates the think tank cycle. If Rand puts a paper out, everybody's playing catch up, and Congress is funding and policies and strategies are made from it. It is the foundational piece of information. So that was the strategy, 2019. Strip away Ukraine. Let's move to, and that's exactly what we got. Exactly what we got. But now Rand is sitting there going, oops, made a mistake. We're wrong. But the thing about the establishment is it can never acknowledge that they're wrong. And as you said, there's a lot of stuff you got to wade through this current paper to get to the conclusion. And it's all false. Russia's this, Russia's that, this is that, this is that. All the foundational truths that they use are wrong. Every single one of them. I've taken it apart. Again, I don't know who would want to publish that paper, but I've spent a lot of time just taking it apart piece by piece. But they get to the conclusion, which is we can't win. We got to get out of this thing now. And when they say we can't win, now we go on to CSIS. Why can't we win? Because we're fundamentally broken as a military and a military industry. That whole military industrial complex, their greed got to them because they stopped being focused on sustaining the national security of America, and they became instead focused on the bottom line of the company, how to make more money. And Congress became greedy about that as well. And so it was about making money. What we didn't do is actually create the structures necessary to make America strong in the modern world. And they're waking up to that fact. F-16s, people talk about, America's going to provide F-16s to the Ukrainians. Well, no, we're not. But even if we wanted to, we can't. There's only one F-16 production line, South Carolina, and it's totally committed to producing F-16V variants for Bulgaria, Poland, and other nations. They have the ability to modify previous F-16s to V standards. There's like 400 that are in the process of that, but that means that there's nothing left for Ukraine. Let's not even talk about pilot training, where you take a Ukrainian pilot who's been focused on flying MiG-29s, and now what, you're going to send him to the Air National Guard advanced integration course or advanced pilot course, a 6-month program to transition from MiG-29 to F-16. It only works, by the way, they've acknowledged this. The only way it works is if you take a former Warsaw Pact pilot who has never flown a MiG in his entire life, and you just take him in and you say, start from scratch. He will graduate with a basic competency in how to take off the F-16, maneuver it a little bit, and land it. He can't do a dogfight. But now you take a guy who's been flying the MiG-29, and all he knows is Soviet avionics, Soviet weapon systems, and you want 6 months for him to transition into a completely different system. It isn't going to happen. It can't happen. He'll be able to take it off, and then he'll be going, I'm confused. And then he dies because the MiG-31 hits him from 40 miles out with the air-to-air missile. He didn't even know it was coming. That's the reality of the F-16. But the point is, getting back to defense industry, we can't support the procurement of F-16s for Ukraine, not on the numbers they want. I mean, Zelensky or somebody was saying 200. Really? 200? Good luck with that. Isn't going to happen because we are not going to give the Ukrainians our frontline F-16s. The same reason why we're not giving them our frontline Abrams, because there's a lot of proprietary equipment in there that only works when you have an American pilot. And if you put it out there and it gets shot down, that's bad business for General Dynamics, because now it shows that the F-16 can't fight. At least this way, General Dynamics can say that was an export version flown by a Ukrainian, not the real thing. But if you give them the real thing and it gets shot down, that's trouble. Same thing with the M1. What? Depleted uranium armor is not going to stop the most advanced Russian anti-tank round? Ooh, we can't admit that. And that's the problem. That's what CSIS is getting at. Mm-hmm. The entire system's broken. Mm-hmm. We don't have anything that works. We can't produce new stuff. We are stuck in this trap. And yet we're spending close to $900 billion a year. And let me just tell you, the F-35 is the model of the reality of American defense industry. Expensive piece of technologically advanced junk that will never fly in combat because it can't survive in combat. And now we're talking about building new, ground launch missiles to replace the Minuteman III. I'm telling you right now, the missile ain't going to work for a long time because that's the way the system's designed. We don't produce functioning missiles right up the bat. And we have to lengthen this thing out. We have to get new contracts, follow on supplementals, and we turn a $300 billion program into a $1 trillion program. The same thing with the new submarines. We're building a new submarine to replace the Ohio class ones that are retiring. I forget the name of the new submarine, but it's not going to work. It's going to take forever to come up. And then it becomes so expensive, we can't buy them in the numbers we want to buy them in. This B-21 Raider, good luck with that, guys. It's literally the bomber version of the F-35. It ain't going to work. That's the reality of the American defense industry and the system. It is fundamentally broken because it's been overcome by politicized greed. What the Russians have done, and done successfully, and nobody focuses on this, is they transition from state-controlled defense industry under the Soviet times, where people can talk about waste, but I'll tell you what, Sadovnikov, the head of the Vodkin's factory, got a couple heroes of Soviet labor. Why? Because he was given a task of producing one of the most technologically advanced solid rocket motors in missiles in the world that had never been done, and he did it that quick, got it out in the field, and it worked. And it worked. That's the way the Soviets did it. Was it as efficient as us? Who cares? They produced a system that worked the first time around. And now they've transitioned that into joint stock companies, which is sort of this interesting combination of state run defense and private enterprise. So there's a lot of flexibility and some profiteering involved, but not like ours. And look how rapidly they're transitioning right now. When Russia says we need to expand production lines overnight, there it is. In America, we need to expand production lines. Not because every congressman now is saying, well, what's in it for me? See, nobody's saying what's good for a country, what's good for defense, what's in it for me. Congress is fundamentally broke because it's all about greed. And as soon as the money, you start talking money of this level, no congressman's going to sit there and say, we're going to let all that money go down to South Carolina. I need a production line built in Long Island. I need a production line built in Wisconsin. And then we're broke. And that's what CSIS is saying. And then IMF is coming up with the reality that sanctions just aren't working. And I encourage everybody that is involved in energy intelligence to focus on the IMF report and what that means, because all of your fundamental basic assumptions about Russian energy are wrong. They're based on fundamentally flawed principles. I mean, Russian economy is pegged at $70 a barrel. No, it's not. Actually, really, it's not. That's sort of a myth that's been created. I know some Russians said, well, we did our budget. But why then, if that's the case, did the Russians get $38 billion in addition to their budget? They received money beyond the budget. Well, that's temporary. It's temporary because they're selling oil. They're selling a lot of oil, but it's the discount. They can't sustain it. Yes, they can. They're smarter than you are. That's why they're winning. They've done it better than the West. I mean, I feel bad for these people because they're trapped in fundamentally flawed methods of thinking, and they can't acknowledge it. And then they write papers, and they reinforce failure. And then they end up like the IMF is right now, looking at all the stuff they wrote, and they go, it's all wrong. Looks like the Russian economy is going to grow, and we got it all wrong. Same thing with CSIS. Russia sucks. Nope, Russia's pretty good. We suck. And they got to say that. And Rand, take Ukraine, weaken Russia. Bad strategy, get the hell out of Ukraine. And they're all happening now because it's like, Russia was nipping away. And all of a sudden, we have this cumulative impact of the harsh realities coming to a head. And everybody's going, holy cow, we were all wrong. And now what we need is for these intellectual think tanks, this information has to be filtered down to the politicians and the political bodies, and eventually will filter back up. And the Tony Blinkens of the world and the Jake Sullivans of the world are going to meet with these people and be told the harsh truth that your policies are fundamentally wrong. They're bad for net security, and we got to get out of this thing now. And here's the thing. We still think we can get out on our terms. That's the epitome of hubris and arrogance, that even though we got everything wrong, somehow we're going to convince the Russians to accept our terms. Putin's beyond that. If Putin if this Odessa moment occurs, it's because Putin wants it to occur, not because America wants it to occur. But this war only ends the way Russia wants it to end. That's a statement of fact, absolute fact.
Do you think this Rand report, this Rand Corp report, this CSIS report, are they a turning point in the way America? And when I say America, we understand what I mean by America. I don't mean the American people. I mean, the elite decision makers are going to approach this war. That from now on, it's now no longer a question of victory. It's a question more of damage limitation, if I can put it in that way.
Yeah, that's the mode we're in right now. We're basically in. Look, what we are in today, right now, is Vietnam, 1973. Where we're going to announce victory with honor when it was victory. It wasn't a victory and there was no honor to it. And then we spent the next 2 years preparing for what we knew was going to happen, which is the defeat of the South. It's not going to take 2 years, but we're now at the point where we're trying to figure out how to call it victory with honor and then get the heck out of there. And I also think there's going to be significant blame transferal to Ukraine, which is the ultimate insult, because we can't say we were wrong. This is going to be about the failure of Ukraine, and we see the direction they're heading, the exposure of corruption, the widespread corruption. We thought the Ukrainians were spending the money we gave them wisely. No, we never thought that, but that's okay. We'll pretend that we thought that. But now it's coming out that, for every $10 we gave, $7 went to corruption, only $3 made. And that's why the Ukrainians failed. We believe the Ukrainians put 100% effort into winning this war. It turned out they weren't. They were corrupt. They were inefficient, incompetent, and we were betrayed by the Ukrainians. That's the next thing that's going to happen. We were betrayed by the Ukrainians. When the reality is we betrayed the Ukrainians.
I wonder if we can go back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the program, which is arms control, because the other thing that I noticed about the RAND report, now this may be that this is an alibi now, but they are, for the first time, seem to be addressing the danger of nuclear escalation, and the fact that if this thing isn't handled properly, if we go on trying to escalate and fail, then there is absolutely no end point to which this cannot go. And I find that interesting because it's the first time, again, where I've seen people from the United States at this sort of level who are starting again to worry about the dangers of nuclear conflict. And do you think this could be, when this is all over, that we're going to find ourselves back in that kind of situation that we did in the late 60s, where there was again an unsuccessful war, Vietnam, and we saw arms control begin, and we started to get the negotiations, and we got the SALT I treaty, the ABM treaty, SALT II, eventually culminating in the INF treaty? Are we perhaps at just the early starting points of this?
Well, the interesting thing is, you take a look at the two main authors of this new RAND report. One of them, the male, actually came into government through the State Department as an arms control specialist. So he's somebody who's familiar with arms control back when we actually were doing some arms control. And I think it's interesting that they picked him to be the co-author of this report, because I think a decision was made that we have to get back to the business of arms control. And I think there's a growing recognition of that. But here's, again, the problem now is, how do we, arms control is like a giant ship. I mean, if anybody's ever been on a cruise, and watching the cruise liner pull into port, you start slowing down way out at sea, and you come in, there's huge momentum, and you come in and you just slowly move up and all that. But the idea that a cruise ship's going to come in and park itself doesn't happen. Arms control is this giant ship that has momentum, and you get it going in a direction, and then you slowly move it and alter it to meet negotiating realities, etc. But it doesn't just go like this overnight. Well, we have slowly gravitated away from genuine arms control, and we're now navigating in a direction that says we support arms control only when it gives unilateral advantage to the United States. We no longer believe in arms control that's mutually beneficial. We want the Russians to concede every point to us. We refuse to talk to them unless they concede every point. And what the Russians have done is what Vladimir Putin warned about. I think it was in 2018 when he gave the speech where he said, he pulled out of ABM, you're talking about INF, and we warned you about this. Are you listening now? Greatest line ever. I mean, are you listening now? And what he did is he said, these are all the new weapons we're deploying, which you have no answer to, by the way, and we don't. So the Russians right now literally have they don't brag about it, but they do have first strike capability. We don't. The Russians don't want to exercise it, and they're purposely keeping their policy away from that. Although some Russians are talking about let's transition into first strike capability to match the American policy, which is one of the most dangerous things in the world now, because you have both sides of first strike, which means that it's actually, it's worse than launch on detection. The problem with launch on detection is oftentimes the detection is wrong, false. And so you detect something, you launch, we all die. But we don't have any, we got to get the ship back in the right direction, which means, one, we have to convince ourselves of the importance of that. And that's what the importance of the RAND study is, that it actually, for the first time, has people saying we need to get back into the serious business of arms control. Mm-hmm. I believe that if we sit down with the Russians seriously, that it is a self-correcting problem. And what I mean by that is the fantasies of the United States of sustaining unilateral nuclear advantage are over, because we've ceded that a long time ago. We're now in the business of trying to get the Russians to come down to our level instead of us sustaining our level. And it's a self-correcting problem. The Russians aren't going to surrender. It will be done through negotiations. And the thing about negotiations is bad negotiators are identified early on and are replaced by good negotiators. And what defines a good negotiator isn't just the ability to articulate the policy directed, but to work with their counterparts to come up with an adequate, mutually satisfying compromise solution. The Russians are very good at this. We need to relearn this. We need to retrain a cadre, but we need to get the people at the table. And that's what is important about this. But we have betrayed the Russians so bad. I mean, we literally, they just don't trust us anymore, and they have no reason to trust us. But the good news is they have people like Anatoly Antonov who understand that no matter how much we being Russia, how much Russia has been betrayed, they have no choice, because an arms race is fatal to everybody. Remember what I said early on when I said, and I'll say it one more time, not you guys, but anybody watching, thank me next time you meet me. Shake my hand and say, thank you for saving the lives, my life, the life of my grandchildren. Because that's what I did. Me and hundreds of others, Americans and Soviets, who brought the INF Treaty and made it work. Made it work even though nobody wanted it to work. We were conspired against by Congress, by the Senate, by our own people in the Defense Department, because they didn't believe in arms control. When they sent us to Vodkinsk, they gave us a mission that didn't have a solution, because the mission was defined in November. The treaty was signed in December without a solution. They spent 6 months trying to come up with the protocols necessary to make it work, and they couldn't, because it was too hard, too complicated. So they simply said to the inspectors and the Soviets on the ground, you figure it out. And we did. We did, even without their support. They abandoned us. They betrayed us. They stabbed us in the back. We worked with our Soviet counterparts. We overcame problems that couldn't have been overcome. It had to have been given to the negotiators. But they gave it to the ground level people who learned to respect one another as human beings, as fellow humans on this journey of preserving life. And we made the damn thing work. It's an amazing, amazing thing that happened. So thank me next time. Buy me a beer. But beyond that, and it's not about me. I just want people to understand how dangerous it was back then and what we actually did to sustain human life. And we need to do it again. That's the thing. We're at that point. We're at that point where if we don't do something, we're all going to die, because this nuclear weapons are not a joke. And when you have nuclear weapons that are attached to a doctrine that has no control, and the American doctrine has no control, we can use nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear environment based upon a threat matrix that we alone define. So even our opponents don't know what triggers the potential of American nuclear escalation. And we have built a series of weapons that provide us with the notion of a winnable nuclear war. We're going through the same thing. This reminds me again, when I studied Rand Corporation early on, they had all these game theorists, game theory about winning a nuclear war. Albert Wolfstetter was the guy I was talking about. He's the guy who wrote some of this basic stuff. And there's another guy, big game theory, Schlesinger or something like that. But these guys actually came up with the notion that we can win a nuclear war. How? By only suffering 100 million dead. That's not a big deal. America will take 100 million casualties. But because we destroyed the Soviet Union's ability to survive as a modern industrial state, it's victory. That ain't victory. That's a loss. We have guys today saying the same thing.
No.
Saying the same thing. The people who reside in Sandia, in Lawrence, Livermore, people who work in any myriad of these think tanks that have rose around like mushrooms around Washington, D.C. They're saying the same sick fantasy about a winnable nuclear conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a winnable nuclear conflict. One nuke is used, it's all over. It will set off a string of reactions that will eventually result in everything dying. We have to stop this now. And that's why the Rand report is so important, because for the first time, we have not just the fringe of the deepest of the deep state, the center of the deep state, the heart, the brain is saying we need arms control. Yeah. And now what we have to do is prevent the world from committing suicide while this kernel of fault germinates and grows and grows and grows until the entire establishment says we have to get back to arms control. Yeah. And then we have to hope that the Russians are willing to sit down at the table with us.
Scott Ritter, you said we should thank you, and I certainly do thank you, both for what you did with the INF Treaty and for answering all my questions. I think this is the point where I'm going to stop, but I'm going to hand over to Alex, if you can be a little longer. We've gone on quite a long time, but I want to see what Alex has to say.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to throw it at you, Scott. How much time do you have to answer a few questions? I know we've been going for about two hours and 10 minutes. Do you have...
Put it this way. I'm on the Duran. All right. So I'm here as long as you guys can tolerate my nonsense. Okay. I'm on the Duran. So, people keep telling me, I have to tell you, you guys, maybe you know how popular you are, but over and over again, people, when are you going to go on the Duran? You got to go on the Duran. You got to go on the Duran. And I'm like, it's not my choice. But you guys invited me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. And so if you got questions and you think that I'm not babbling incoherently, ask your questions. I'm ready. I'm here for you guys.
Okay, great. We've got questions from all of our viewers, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. We'll try to knock these out as best we can. There are a lot of questions, and we don't want to keep you here on the show all day, Scott. Either we respect your time, and we know that you're a very busy man. Actually, one of the super chats, which I just forgot who sent it, but one of the super chats was, "Hey Scott, how do you go on so many shows? Where do you find the time?"
Well,
I forgot who sent that, but I remember it because it was an interesting question.
I'm what they call a writer, which means I'm supposed to be writing. But that means I'm also at home, generally speaking. And what happened is when this whole thing started, I never did podcasts, but somebody called up and said, would you come on and do it? It might've been you guys brought me on early on. I don't know. I wrote an article and you brought me on, and then people just kept calling up saying they want on. And, I'm somebody who believes very strongly in the idea of the empowerment of the citizen through the gathering of knowledge and information that promotes civil discourse, dialogue, and debate. And that's what this does. I mean, we're sitting here having a conversation, and hopefully people are listening to this and they're getting their minds to work, and then they'll work through problems and they empower themselves. I use as a mantra, knowledge is power. And I believe in that firmly. So therefore they say, how do you find the time? Because this is the most important thing in the world that I can be doing. I mean, I'm only one person, but I've been given an opportunity to reach out and participate in the very processes I find to be invaluable when it comes to the empowerment of humans, of citizens, so that they can hold their governments accountable and maybe get them to do, good policy for a change. So it's not that I'm, how do I find the time? The time finds me. This is the most important thing in the world to be doing right now. I firmly believe that. I am a human. There is only so much. My voice will probably give out at some point, not right now, but eventually. I think a lot of people noticed I had a huge cough a while ago. I literally drove myself almost to the grave by doing this kind of work, and I have to watch out for that. I have to learn how to ratchet back and all that stuff. But I also have to remember that I don't make any money off of this online stuff. I only make money by writing, and so at some point in time, I have to find the balance between doing what I think is one of the most important things I can be doing, which is talking to people such as yourself, getting out to as many different audiences. Because that's the other thing. Some people said, well, Scott, you're repeating yourself. Yeah, because we're talking during a specific time frame where specific issues are important. But the Duran audience is not necessarily the same audience as a German blogger, or the same audience as a Russian blogger, or the same audience as another American blogger. And so it's imperative for me, at least, to get my message out, not my message, to get the process of discussion and debate and dialogue out to as many different people as possible. That means appearing on whatever responsible. I'm not going to say respectable, because who am I to determine what's respectable? People who are responsible in terms of their questions and their approach. If they ask me to come on, my policy so far is to say yes. But I do have to remember, I mean, and if you allow me just one thing, I put a lot of time into these podcasts, and I don't get any money from it. I'm not asking for any money, but I do have a Substack, scotritterextra.com. And if you guys think it's important for me to be on something like this, then you got to help me out, because the day that comes where in order to pay the bills, I have to turn off the computer podcast and start writing papers nonstop. That's what will happen. So if people think me being on shows like this is worthwhile, please, go to my Substack. It doesn't cost you anything. You can actually subscribe for free. But if you think this is good, help out a little bit so that I can continue to do this, because the will to do this can only be matched by the ability to continue doing this by paying a mortgage and, eating, paying heating bills, etc. So that's that. I answered it, and I gave my stupid little pitch, what I hate to do, but it's a reality. I mean, the bottom line is these things don't happen. You guys know, the realities of trying to sustain something like this.
I am a subscriber, by the way. Just to let
Thank
you
you
know.
very much.
We'll put a link to the Substack as well as a pinned comment down below, so everyone can find you on Substack as well. Let's see.
I'll try to do a better job, Alexander, because if you're subscribing, I now know that I have a harsh sharp intellectual mind reading it. I got to be much more careful about my typos. I've been publishing stuff quickly, and people are like, you have a typo. Sorry. It happens.
Let's see. From Gail, is BRICS the new NATO for Russia? What will that look like for World War III?
Well, first of all, BRICS is I wouldn't call it the new NATO. BRICS is the counter to the G7. BRICS is economic in nature. Remember, the G7 is pretty much the economic arm of the same political, geopolitical group that NATO is from. So G7 policy is the economic policy of NATO. BRICS, even though it hasn't come, what we're seeing is the expansion of BRICS. We're starting to see it populated by nations that are part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So even though there's not a direct relationship between SCO and BRICS, it's becoming that way, so that BRICS sort of becomes the economic version. But the SCO isn't a military organization. There's the CSTO, which is the Commonwealth States Treaty Organization. That's not even a NATO equivalent. There is no NATO equivalent out there. NATO is a unique insult to the world. A defensive alliance that isn't a defensive alliance, that has no purpose other than to promote wars of destruction designed to create justification for the continued funding of the respective defense industries of Europe and the United States. That's it. There is no equivalent of that out there, thank goodness. So BRICS isn't going to be the equivalent of the G7, because BRICS isn't attached to the kind of militaristic aggressive policies that are out there. The SCO is about the Trans-Eurasian Economic Union. That's what their focus is on, economic growth. And thank God, because eventually NATO will collapse. I believe this in all my heart, sooner rather than later. And when that happens, it won't be replaced by the opponent rushing in with a thing. It'll be replaced by an opponent that says the key to world peace is a law-based international order founded in the principles of the United Nations Charter, and we are promoting a multipolarity vision of global economy, where the United States isn't dictating the terms of economic coexistence to everybody, but the world is making its own terms based upon what's best for everybody, not one.
All right. Jetset.1 says, Scott, how many T-14 armadas has Russia produced to date?
That is a classified number. And if I knew, I would tell you, but I don't know. But the answer is very few. I think maybe a battalion's worth, which might be under 50. It's a tank that isn't conducive at this point in time to mass production. It's a tank that so far has been produced, one at a time on assembly, and because of the demands of this conflict, the Russians, I think rightfully so, have made a decision not to try and mass produce the T-14, which would result in smaller numbers of tanks, but to mass produce the T-90, which is a very, very good tank. And so they're cranking out 20, 30, 40 of these a month. The T-14, I think they might even hit the pause button. There's some talk that T-14 units have moved into the special military. I think if the Russians were smart, the T-14 would stay in a barracks area by Moscow and be painted up pretty to parade around. But I'm not a Russian general, but the T-14 is not. It might be the tank of the future, but it's not the tank of the present.
Angry Rawhawk says, Scott, I forgot to ask you this in our Q&A yesterday. Where does
Too late.
this? Well. Okay. Well,
I'm joking.
Angry Warhawk also wants you to plug his channel, by the way. And the question is, where does this idea that Russia has low quality military equipment and are generally incompetent, where does this come from? And the plug for Angry Warhawk's YouTube channel.
Well, Angry Warhawk and Juan Rodriguez, I don't remember his pen name. They've been interviewing me. They're, again, some people I view them as responsible interviewers. And we did an interview yesterday. So I don't know the name of the YouTube channel, but if you Google Angry Warhawk and you find his YouTube channel, I highly recommend, at least where they are interviewing me. They ask very good questions. They're trying to dig deeper into some very difficult issues. The idea of inferior Soviet equipment or Russian equipment goes back to the mindset of the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, when we were transitioning out of Vietnam and trying to build up a European army capable of defeating a Soviet Warsaw Pact incursion. And our entire philosophy is we couldn't outproduce them. There's no way we could produce more tanks than them, et cetera. So what we decided to do is we're going to produce better tanks and we're going to come up with better weaponry. And so this myth was created of the superiority of the American military equipment. And we actually believe that if the Soviets came across, we were going to get in a fight where we're going to take them out 5-1. So, every time we lost one of our M60 A3s or one of our new M1s, we were going to at least take out 5 of their tanks. And that, so it was quality over quantity. When the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, the CIA organized some teams. And I can talk about this because people have talked about this, so I'm not giving away the farm. But they worked with German intelligence, technical intelligence, and they sent teams across into East Germany to take advantage of the chaos to gain access to Russian garrisons and steal technology, either driving away with the whole system or at least taking samples, photographs, etc. And what they found was that the premise that American technology was inherently superior to Soviet technology was fundamentally flawed. See, we believed that we had an anti-tank round that could penetrate the best Soviet armor. And what we found out is the Soviet armor was better than anything we had, that we would be firing rounds that bounced off Soviet tanks. We also believed that our armor could survive the best anti-tank round that the Soviets had. And we found out that wasn't true. The best anti-tank round would cut through our armor like a hot knife through butter. So it's a fundamentally flawed premise that has sustained itself through the end of the Cold War, when the Russian military, the Soviet military pretty much dissolved and the Russians were struggling. The period of the 1990s, the Russian military was underfunded, poorly trained. We saw the disaster, that what happened to the Russians in Chechnya first round, when that, the regiment went in and got trapped in Grozny and literally slaughtered. The Russians didn't perform well. But that's separate from defense industry. The Russian defense industry is comprised of some of the best scientists the world has ever seen. And these guys never stopped doing their job. They always continued to do their research and development, and they always continued to be on the cutting edge of technology. Now, that technology wasn't immediately linked to mass production, so we didn't see it rectified and or we didn't see it manifested in what the Soviets were deploying mainstream. They were basically, for the longest time, relying on old Soviet era equipment that they were upgrading. Take a look at the T-72 and the various upgrades and modifications that have been put on that. But they've kept it there. And then as the Soviet economy began to coalesce and Soviet defense industry began to link up with these joint stock organizations, we started to see the quality of their defense material start to move out into the military. And today, believe me, the quality of the Soviet gear out there is world class. It's some of the best in the world. This notion that it's inferior to the West is just an absolute fundamental fallacy. Again, the West has not been in the business of preparing for a large-scale ground combat in Europe for the last 20 years. We've been focused on low-intensity conflict. And I wrote about this a while back. I said that Central Command is basically taking over the entire American military enterprise and everything that's happened to the U.S. military, from recruitment to uniform design to equipment. I mean, we spent more time at developing, IED-resistant MRAPs, which have zero utility in modern warfare, by the way. They only exist to drive on roads in Afghanistan and Iraq and take up mine and not kill everybody inside, V-shaped hull and all that stuff. We spent a lot of money on anti-IED warfare, zero utility. And all the things we're spending money on have no utility in reality. The last thing we're spending money on is advancing armored warfare. Our tanks were sitting in the barracks doing nothing because the armored units didn't train on them as for large-scale combat, because the armored units were actually being deployed overseas to meet manpower shortages in Iraq and Afghanistan as glorified infantry units. That's our reality. The Russians, on the other hand, we talked about this. They were doing the exact opposite, getting ready. Their technology has been designed solely for defeating the NATO enemy, and that technology is there. And it's not false. This is simply a continuation of the flawed arguments that were developed in the 1980s, where we said that our qualitative supremacy will allow us to think about fighting the Russians with a distinct numerical disadvantage. We were wrong, because apparently the Russians had some pretty good equipment, and they have really good equipment today. So we're wrong again to think that 14 tanks is somehow going to turn the tide of the battle.
Scott, the only way it makes sense for the upcoming Russian offensive in Kharkov, do you see it that way as well?
Eventually, yes, I do agree that Kharkov is the key. Not because it's the key, because to secure Lugansk, you have to take Kharkov. That's the bottom line. Right now, the front line is right on the Lugansk border, but that means that Ukrainian artillery can reach in and touch civilians in Lugansk. And the Russians have said, we're just not going to give Ukraine that option. So when they eventually push out of Lugansk, they're going to push up. And if you take a look at the artillery range, simply take a compass and draw on a map, the range of HIMARS or the range of the Caesar and all that stuff, and then see where you are and understand how close to Kharkov you are and why it's impossible to sustain a front line that close to such a major logistical hub, that you're going to need to push through Kharkov, get beyond that, in order to have defensible space. So I agree that Russia's going to have to take Kharkov.
Different perspective asks, I just can't see how we could win. China is defensive, so their planes have a place to land. Wouldn't they just use hypersonic missiles to take out the naval fleet and airfields? Where would they land?
Understand this, that right now, Taiwan is on its own in terms of its defense, immediate defense capabilities. When Joe Biden says, yes, we're going to come to the defense of Taiwan, with what? You're going to bring American troops in. Let's take a look at how American troops typically deploy. Let's look at the Middle East. When we deploy to support either Desert Storm or Iraqi freedom, we have troops fly in on large aircraft, to airfields that are friendly. So we're landing in a friendly space. The troops can come off the airplanes, load onto buses, and then be driven to a port facility, which is again friendly and allows American shipping to come in without any opposition to offload all the equipment. And then we get to sit there in a logistical base, marry up with the equipment, make sure it all works before we organize into our respective forces and move out. That ain't going to happen in Taiwan, because as the ship comes in, it will be sunk somewhere around 200 miles off the coast of Taiwan by a Chinese hypersonic missile. As the airplanes come in, they will be shot down by Chinese air defense systems that reach out and touch anything over Taiwan. Our fighter airplanes, what, they're going to launch from the carriers? First of all, how close can the carriers get without being sunk? Because they will be sunk if they get too close. So what? We're going to keep the carriers way out here, launch our fighters with some air refueling capability so they top off and able to extend a combat air patrol over for how long? Because they're sucking up fuel. One dogfight and they're done. They're going to crash in the ocean. They're out of fuel. And all the Chinese have to do is shoot down the tankers, and we can't get back to the carrier. That's stupidity. And the same thing with planes flying out of Japan. Takeoff, again, they require fuel. And dogfight uses a lot of fuel. And if you don't have refueling capability there, but the refueling capability in order to protect it is going to require its own combat air patrol. Now, we tend to practice that nowadays by throwing out 40 airplanes, and we put 12 out there. Then we have 30 airplanes doing the tanker protection, all that stuff. And the Chinese are going, that's all you got, because that's all we got. Well, they're going to shoot down those 12 because they're going to hit them with about 200. And they're going to bring the remainder of those 200 over here, and they're going to take out these guys, and we got nothing left. That's just the reality. We can't defend Taiwan. We literally cannot defend Taiwan. If we try to defend Taiwan, we will lose our entire fleet. Our Navy operates off of legacy thinking that dates back to World War II. And that's what people need to understand. The carrier battle group, which was the centerpiece of naval power projection, is a World War II era legacy that is no longer survivable in the modern world. It simply won't survive. It can't survive. The Iranians would sink all of our ships if we tried to repeat Desert Storm. The Chinese will sink all of our ships if we try to reinforce Taiwan.
Commander Crossfire asks, if Russia needs to take Kharkov to protect Lugansk, wouldn't they need to protect Kharkov, and so on and so on? Isn't the whole of Ukraine or nothing? Isn't it the whole of Ukraine or nothing?
Not if you destroy the entire Ukrainian army and you destroy the Ukrainian nation's ability to sustain itself politically, economically, socially, which is what the Russian objective is. So I think, the Russian plan calls for the grinding down of the Ukrainian military to absolutely nothing. And when I mean nothing, I don't mean to laugh. I'm sorry, because you have to laugh or else you cry, because it's just mind numbing what we're talking about here. The number of human lives that are going to be lost is just sickening. But they're going to do it. And then they're going to bomb Ukraine into submission. So, yeah, if the goal was to allow Ukraine to survive as a modern nation state with all the inherent infrastructure intact, and therefore allow Ukraine to sustain itself militarily with some sort of residual force, you're right. Because once you take Kharkov, then you got to push on and protect Kharkov, and then you got to push on, and when do you end? You end when you get to the Polish border. But I think that this goes beyond that. I think this goes into what you have to factor in: a strategic air campaign that is going to destroy Ukraine's ability to exist as a modern nation state, and that will precipitate the absolute collapse of Ukraine and a surrender that is inclusive of a new political reality that makes the Russian concerns about Ukrainian artillery moot, because there won't be any Ukrainian artillery, and there won't be a Ukrainian government that is desirous of employing artillery against Russia.
Right. Jules D says, Scott, in your opinion, is Poland going into Western Ukraine?
Poland wants to go into, some parts of Poland want to go into Western Ukraine. But no, I don't think Poland's going to go into. Here's the tricky part. If the Russians have been very good at what I call escalation management, meaning that they haven't done beyond that first push, which was very aggressive, the initial push, they haven't done anything precipitous since then. It's been very, everything's modulated and moderated, et cetera, because they don't want to create an excuse for an emergency intervention. One of the things Russia's going to have to watch out, especially with the strategic air campaign, is the combination of sustained military pressure in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine with a strategic air campaign could generate a refugee crisis. And I think Europe is already saturated, both in terms of their tolerance of Ukrainian refugees, but also their ability to sustain Ukrainian refugees. And so if you get 15 million people rushing the Polish border, and Poland says no, and now you have a humanitarian catastrophe building up there, there might be pressure to create a humanitarian corridor. One only has to think back to what was going on in Syria, to create a humanitarian corridor, which would require troops on the ground. But remember, troops on the ground have to have air protection, so it will require some sort of air projection in, which means air defense. And so you create a de facto NATO presence in Western Ukraine. That would be problematic for Russia because right off the bat, Belarus says they won't tolerate that. And Belarus now is in some sort of a military union with Russia. And I think Russia would feel compelled to act. And I don't think Russia wants to act, even though they have troops up there that have the potential of responding to a Polish incursion. I think the last thing Russia wants to do is actually come down into Western Ukraine. They want to be hands off Western Ukraine. That is a nightmare. That's a problem that Ukraine is going to have to solve post-war. But so you have to manage this war in a way that doesn't create a political need for NATO to intervene. And the same thing is true with Odessa and southern Russia. You have to manage that to keep Romania and Moldova from creating some sort of problem with Transnistria. So I think, Russia is going to be managing this war in a way that prevents that. But there are some Polish nationalists who are talking about Western Ukraine. But people, again, have to understand the history. The Western Ukrainians are literally the progeny of Stepan Bandera. And just look up the Volyn massacre, what happened in 1943, 44, 110,000 Polish civilians slaughtered by these Western Ukrainians. There's no love lost between the two. And the last thing Poland needs to do is inherit that nightmare.
Yeah. Let's do a couple more questions because we've been going for 2 hours and 40 minutes almost. And you've been doing a lot of talking, Scott. You've been doing a lot of talking, Alexander. So I don't want to push this too much. Let's. Huck Finn said he sent the earlier question about Kharkov. He just says maybe my question was misunderstood. Do you think that the Russian upcoming offense will start with Kharkov as the most unlikely place to start the offensive?
I think Russia's going to attack where they get the most strategic advantage. That's what we're seeing right now is the shaping of the battlefield, defining the battlefield, allowing the battlefield to define itself. Rather than coming in with a preordained conclusion that we are going to attack here, Russia has strategic objectives, but you can get to them with multiple axes of advances. And so Russia right now is stressing the front lines, seeing how the Ukrainians react, and then where the Ukrainians provide the best opportunity for immediate, rapid military success, Russia will attack at that point. That's what I believe. I just it's foolhardy to. The only reason I say this is again a little bit of background. In the lead up to the Gulf War, I was brought on this special planning committee for the Commandant of the Marine Corps, where we planned a large-scale amphibious operation against the Iraqis as a way to better use Marine forces. And I came up with the plan, and I had to think it through. And I'm talking about, I was a captain, and I'm having to brief this to the commandant, all the 4-star generals, all the 3-star generals, all the colonels in the Marine Corps. And they're all asking questions. And I learned a lot through that process about planning and about assumptions and everything. And what I learned is that if you come in with a preordained plan, no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. That's the bottom line. And so what they kept telling me is if I want to achieve this, what am I going to do to make that happen? What do I have to do to create that opportunity? So let's say Russia has a direction they want to go. They're going to be shaping the battlefield to create that opportunity. But then the other thing I was taught by these very smart men is that if that doesn't manifest itself, don't be trapped to that plan. I mean, be open to thinking of alternatives as you develop this. So let's say Russia says they want to go through Zaporizhia. I'm just making it up right now. I'm not saying. But as they develop that, they realize that that's not the best opportunity. The Ukrainians have actually solidified that line, and they've created a secondary line of defense, and you're not going to get the rate of advance you want. You're not going to achieve what you wanted to achieve. But up here in Kharkov, the Ukrainians have bled the line dry. They only got 20 guys per kilometer, and there's nothing in the rear. And here's an opportunity to slice in and do this. Don't be married to Zaporizhia. Go to Kharkov. That's all I'm saying, is that I think that's how I was taught to plan real world, large scale combat operations. And the Russians are some of the best in the world at this. And I think that's how they're taught to plan, that no successful military is married to a course of action, that there are always alternatives, and those alternatives will be developed as the situation develops. And that's what we were talking about at the very beginning. All these offenses that are taking place, all this offensive action that's taking place, isn't designed to win the war. It's designed to force the Ukrainians to commit to a course of action that defines the battlefield. And as that battlefield is defined, the Russians are going to be looking for the best opportunities to accomplish the strategic objectives that they've laid out. And that if that means cutting north of Kharkov, if it means cutting through Izium, if it means, going to Kramatorsk, if it means what, we don't know. Only the Russians know. But that's what I think is going on.
All right. Schedule another session for the questions only with Scott. That might not be a bad idea. There's a lot of questions from a lot of viewers, Scott. I mean, a lot of questions. So, I mean, let's do like one or two more, and we'll figure out how to get all of these questions packaged and answered. Zariel wanted to know, how long do you think NATO's going to last, Scott?
Well, NATO, I mean, even though it's a military alliance, it's become a political. It's literally the political glue that's holding Europe together right now. Look, the European Union's on its deathbed. If you take a look, and again, I'm getting into an area that I am not the world's greatest mind on. So right now, people are rolling their eyes. Shut up, Scott. Don't talk economics because you don't know anything about it. You're right, I don't. But I do know enough that German banking philosophy is fundamentally different from French banking philosophy. One is conservative, the other one is liberal. And we're taking a look at the European Union moving forward. We have competing ideologies from the German bank and the French bank on how to go forward. It's creating a fracture within Europe. So there's already economic fractures, and we saw that with Meloni coming into power in Italy and challenging this. So there's these deep fractures there, and it's being exacerbated by the British withdrawing, further fracturing, etc. So the thing that's holding this together is the NATO framework of this supposedly defensive alliance, but it's really a political alliance. This is why Jens Stoltenberg has such a viable voice. Why do people listen to Stoltenberg more than they listen to Borrell? Well, because NATO's more important than the EU when it comes to defining European vision. But this war is going to create horrific fractures within NATO. NATO is going to become unsustainable because in order to survive, it's going to have to go back to being a military alliance, which means all the people who have been getting the free ride off of the Americans for decades now have to pony up at a time when their economies can't sustain the ponying up. So it's going to collapse of its own volition. How long is that going to take? I don't know. I think it's going to take longer than people would want it to, but it's going to happen within my lifetime. That's a guarantee. And hopefully it will happen while my brain still works. I don't know how long it is till senility sets in, but I'd like to believe that I'll be able to be cognizant of the collapse of NATO. 5 years, 10 years, but it's a ruined institution. It has no credibility anymore and no viability. And that's going to become painfully obvious. One of the most difficult parts of this conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, won't be the military victory, because I said I believe this is going to happen this year. It's going to be the political, and I'm not going to call it a victory. It's going to be the political settlement that's going to have to take place between Russia and Europe. And this could take time. This could take several years. And there's a couple things that have to factor into that. I mean, Putin is up for election 2026. When
I think it's sooner than that. I'm not absolutely sure.
2024.
2024, yeah.
Yeah, but then it's 6 years. So he has 6 years after that. And then, look, no matter how how vibrant this guy is, at some point in time, even Vladimir Putin is going to get old. So, and I think Russia hasn't solved the post-Putin problem yet. And that's one of the biggest problems facing Russia. And so, and Putin knows this. If you go back, I know we're getting a little off track here, but when you take a look at the controversy that when Putin rewrote the Constitution, in the last election, he did that because there's a reality that because of Western interference in Russian democracy, Russia was incapable of producing a new Putin. Incapable. That if Putin stepped aside, Russia didn't have the means to continue. So Putin said, okay, we're going to consolidate power, and I have 2 terms to fix this problem. Now, the West has complicated this because of the war, but in many ways, it actually made it easier because now it's the domestic picture inside Russia is far more streamlined and it makes sense. So I think Putin has to work that the two are going to work in path, that the post-Putin Russia is going to be linked to what solution can be reached with Europe about a new European security framework. And a new European security framework cannot be viable with NATO as it's currently configured. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure built into that little policy triangle path that we just defined, that the pressure that's going to be placed on NATO to disband or diminish. That's that.
Let's see here. The final question, and we'll figure out a way to get these questions answered because there are a lot of questions. We'll figure it out. We'll discuss after the show and see how we do this. But let me just read one question from locals from 1821 AOR. For Scott Ritter, a call to duty. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Your nation needs millions of veterans to answer the call. Serve one more time and to march on Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King way, stop NATO, end colonial wars. Join the call to action for the nation and for world peace.
Well, what I'll say is this, and here I'm going to get a little pie in the sky on you. I wrote a book. We've talked about the book, Disarm at the Time of Perestroika, and I think it's a great book. Do you guys have copies of the book?
Yes, a Kindle copy. I have to say, because that's how I read things now.
Okay, but if you want a signed copy, just send me your address and I'll get it to you. The book right now is being translated into Russian, and the goal is to get it into a mainstream Russian publisher, and then to go on a Russian book tour, where I take the book and the message of the book, the message of disarmament, to Russia. And I think that this is going to be one of those unique moments of revelation of the reality of Russia. And I think it's just going to be a great opportunity that has to be captured. And so I'm going to bring a documentary film crew to capture this. Then I'm going to make a movie. And then I'm going to show the movie throughout America as follow-on book tour. And my goal is to get Americans exposed to the reality of Russia and the importance of arms control. And the end objective here is put 1 million people in the street of Washington, D.C., not protesting against anything, but protesting in support of arms control and nuclear disarmament, to send a signal to Washington, D.C., but they're not to march alone. I want 1 million Russians in the streets of Russian cities, not marching in opposition to anything they're going, but marching in support and solidarity with these people. So I agree. Get off your beep. We'll bleep out that word. Get on your feet and let's move. But we got to organize this. We got to get this message out. But the most dangerous threat to America and the world today is nuclear war. And the only way to mitigate that threat is through disarmament. And the only way to get disarmament is to wake our politicians up. We can't wait for RAND reports to hint at the importance of arms control, because it could spin out of control and we can die. We need to get boots on the ground, in the streets, peaceful, not protesting against, protesting for, letting our leaders know that disarmament and nuclear disarmament is one of the most important issues for the American people. And we need that policy done. And then we need to convince people that this isn't going to weaken us. We need the Russian people to come up again, not in opposition to what their government's doing, but in solidarity with this message. Because remember, it's not Russia that left these arms control treaties. It's us. It's not Russia that has lied to the Americans. It's the Americans that have lied to Russia. So the Russians don't have to. I mean, if they were Americans, they would never do this. They would say, no, we have all the advantages. We don't need to do this. But they're not. They're Russians with compassion, with a heart. I'm hoping I can motivate them. And I'm hoping I can motivate the American people so we can have sometime in the not too distant future this demonstration in support of saving the world, disarmament. Now, you say that's pie in the sky. Look, I participated in the Million Man March in London back in 2002, and I've done demonstrations here. And I'm not a big believer in demonstrations. I'm really not. But I had a guy remind me the last time I spoke. He said, in 1982, we put 1 million people in Central Park in support of disarmament. And I went, holy cow, let's do that again. So that's where I'm at. So yeah, I agree with the guy. We need to march for peace, march for nuclear disarmament. And I will be calling upon you and everybody else. I'm saying, when I say you, I mean the guy who asked the question. I will be calling upon you to strap on your boots one more time and make one more effort, one more push for the cause. And the cause is saving the world so that your grandchildren can grow up and enjoy the same miracle of life that we all do.
Thank you for that. That's a brilliant way. That's a brilliant place to stop.
To stop this show. Thank you very much, Scott. A great live stream, nearly 3 hours. Any final thoughts? I mean, that was a great final thought, Scott, but any final thoughts, Alexander?
I just wanted
out the show.
I should have said this. I absolutely do recommend Scott's book. It's absolutely a wonderful book, if I may say. And of course, it was very moving to me because, of course, I remember all that time in the 1980s when we had the INF Treaty. It's a time of hope. I mean, it seems extraordinary today. Yeah. A hope that was thrown away, but there's something left. And the very fact that we had that experience and that we've seen how it worked shows that it can be done. It can be done again. So absolutely do read Scott, do get Scott's book, do absolutely read it. And I read everything now on Kindle, I'm afraid, because as everybody knows, I have eye problems. But Scott, I will certainly get myself a hard copy. And when you come to London, or when I find myself in Albany, did you say?
Albany, New York. Well, just come to New York City. I can make my way down.
New York City, one of my favorite places. Then definitely, I would love to have your signature.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And again, thank you guys for having me on. Like I said, everybody was saying, you got to go on the Duran. I'm like, they got to ask. You asked, I'm here. And I think I'm grateful for you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and answer the questions from your audience.
Thank you very, very much, Scott. Thank you, Alexander. Once again, we will have all of Scott's information, the book, Substack, Twitter. It will be down below as a pinned comment. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, theduran.locals.com. And thank you very, very much to all of our fantastic moderators, Zariel, Alan Watson, Peter Valies, and I hope I didn't miss anybody. Thank you very, very much. Reckless Abandon. Thank you very much. Very, 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 very much to our moderators. That is the show. Take care, everybody.